Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting of 2025 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. This morning we will be considering two SSIs before taking further evidence on our work on artificial intelligence. So to begin with, we have agenda item 1. Sorry, first of all, can I note apologies from Sarah Boyack, Lorna Slater and Stephen Kerr. Moving to agenda item 1, I welcome this morning Ivan McKee, Minister for Public Finance, and online Alistair Hamilton, Procurement Policy Portfolio Manager, and also Jess Gray, lawyer, both from the Scottish Government, who will be presenting on the SSI concerning Procurement Iraq Free Trade Agreement Miscellaneous Amendment. And with that, I would invite Ivan McKee to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. As committee members know, while the negotiation of international agreements is a reserved matter, implementation can occur in devolved areas. In particular, agreements often include provisions providing for reciprocal access to public procurement. Accordingly, Scottish procurement regulations set out that bidders from countries with which a relevant agreement applies are entitled to equal treatment when bidding for contracts in Scotland. This instrument updates the list of relevant agreements by inserting a reference to a new agreement between the UK and Iraq. The effect of this will be to ensure that suppliers from Iraq will be entitled to the same treatment as Scottish or other UK suppliers when bidding for contracts which are covered by this agreement. Under the terms of the agreement, Scottish bidders will, of course, be entitled to equal treatment when bidding for contracts in Iraq. It is worth noting that this agreement is based on the agreement between the EU and Iraq, which of course ceased to apply to the UK after Brexit. In that sense, this can be largely regarded as a restoration of rights and obligations which existed until that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask the Minister, so just for clarity, this essentially means that Iraqi firms need to be given equal consideration when bidding for public work and vice versa for Scottish firms in Iraq. Just in practical terms, looking at the sort of the balance of trade, both the sort of industrial and economic base of both countries, are there likely to be Iraqi firms? But has there been any analysis of that? And likewise, what might the opportunities be for Scottish firms to bid for public contracts in Iraq?
So I think in both directions the trade currently is pretty minimal, but clearly this is something that obviously we'd hope to grow over time, although Iraq obviously isn't one of the priority countries in our export plan. Data that we've got, this is from HMRC regional trade stats, of £45 million of good exported from Scotland to Iraq in 2024. But the data only shows about £1 million of goods coming in the other way. Both of those are about 8% of the UK total. So,
and so, could I thank the Minister for that answer in terms of sort of the economic value? I mean, are there any sort of practical or any other consideration?
No, I don't think that there's any instance, officials can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's any instances of Iraqi firms bidding into UK to Scottish public procurement as at yet, but yeah, clearly this is just to add them onto the list of countries that can do so.
Are there any questions arising from members? Okay, so then move on to agenda item 2, which is then the formal consideration of the motion. And I remind that only members and the ministers may take part in this part of proceedings. And I invite the Minister to speak to and move the motion S6M 19302 that the Economy and Fair Work Committee consider the Public Procurement Iraq Free Trade Agreement and Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2025. So the question is that motion S6M 19302 be approved. Are we all agreed? I then move on to agenda item 3, which is taking evidence on the Cross-Border Public Procurement Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations Act 2025. Again, I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. It's become commonplace over recent years for contracting authorities bound by public procurement legislation to cooperate where it makes sense to do so. Until recently, this was a fairly straightforward exercise as the procedural rules on awarding contracts on such matters as minimum timescales, type of notice which must be published and so on were substantially the same across the whole of the UK. Earlier this year, however, the UK Government commenced the Procurement Act 2023, and this had the effect of changing the procedural rules applicable elsewhere in the UK. This meant that new provisions were needed to cater for the scenario when a devolved Scottish contracting authority is awarding a contract under an arrangement put in place elsewhere in the UK, or indeed vice versa. The Procurement Act 2023 gave both UK and Scottish ministers powers to address this, and the Scottish Parliament agreed a legislative consent motion on this point. The UK Government exercised its power following engagement with us and through public consultation, and set out in legislation the elements of the 2023 Act which will apply to devolved Scottish authorities when they are awarding a contract under UK arrangements. This draft instrument seeks to mirror the provision made by the UK Government by setting out the provisions of the Scottish procurement legislation which will apply to UK authorities when awarding a contract under devolved Scottish procurement arrangements. Both this instrument and the UK equivalent legislation are drafted with the intention of only applying those provisions of the other regime as are necessary to allow the contract to be awarded. These can reasonably be described as procedural rules rather than policy-driven rules. The exception to this is where two or more authorities are conducting a joint procurement exercise and one is leading the exercise on behalf of the others. In this case, the applicable regime would be the home regime of the authority which is conducting the exercise. This is a relatively technically complex instrument, but is intended to allow cooperation on procurement to continue as appropriate.
Thank you very much, Minister. Again, can I begin just by asking, just in practical terms, what this will mean? Again, my understanding is this is essentially enabling devolved bodies to use UK-wide procurement frameworks. So again, I mean, are there practical examples where that either has happened or indeed that the Scottish Government or its agencies are intending to use these provisions? If you could just outline some examples.
Yeah, so I'll ask officials to come in on specifics, and obviously if you look across the public sector landscape and the procurement within the public sector in Scotland, there's been a huge amount of work done over recent years to encourage the use of framework contracts, and we've saved hundreds of millions of pounds by doing that just in the Scottish context, with different public bodies cooperating on those frameworks, and clearly the same can apply across the whole of the UK where it makes sense to do so, and that obviously has been the case up to now, and all that this instrument does is with the new UK procurement legislation enables that process to continue because it dovetails in the different procedural requirements so that cooperation continues to be technically possible. I'll ask officials to come in if they get any specific examples on that, and if there's any more detail you need on that, very happy to come back. So I don't know, Alistair? Oh, you're on mute. No.
Thanks. Sorry, it
well, that's us. You know, Alistair.
Yeah. So in terms of specific examples of cooperation, in the sense of Scottish contracting authorities using UK-wide frameworks, Crown Commercial Services is obviously the biggest provider of these frameworks, and big national frameworks on the likes of IT, for example. In the opposite direction, advanced purchasing for universities and colleges and the HEFE sector in Scotland is a prime example of where cooperation flows the other way, and actually some frameworks put in place by Scottish HEFE institutions are used by the counterparts across the rest of the UK.
Okay. Thank you. Again, just a subsequent question. I mean, procurement is a topic that comes up quite regularly at this committee, and again, one of the regular points is actually about how open procurement processes are to the broadest range of firms, especially smaller firms. Again, is this will this help with this, or is it largely to one side of that topic? But again, I just thought it was important to raise it.
No, absolutely, it's a very important topic. Technically, obviously, it's a continuation of what we're doing, so it's putting in place the regulations that allow us to continue to do what we've done up to now, and that, of course, opens up the procurement more broadly. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Obviously, if you're putting bigger contracts out, then it's more, which you would do if you amalgamate them across a wider geography. You obviously run the risk of there being bigger suppliers bidding for those. But the focus, when it's a separate focus, but it's a very important focus of the Scottish procurement policy with regard to supporting SMEs to access public sector contracts is something that's hugely thoroughly embedded in the process, and I think with some success. So we're at the state now where 47% of Scottish public sector procurement spend went to SME in the last published data. That compares with a number of around 20% across the whole of the UK. So I think we've made some significant progress there, but always more work to do.
And again, are there any questions coming from members? No? So I then move on to agenda item 4, which is formal consideration of the same SSI. I would like to remind that only members and the Minister may take part in this section, and I invite the Minister to speak to and move the motion S6M 19428 that the Economy and Fair Work Committee recommends that the Cross-Border Public Procurement Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025 draft be approved.
Moved, Convener.
Are there any points from members? No. So again, the question is that the motion S6M 19428 be approved. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. So a short report will be prepared and published, and I invite the committee just to delegate report clearance to me as convener. Is that acceptable to the committee?
Yes.
And now we will shortly suspend in order to change witnesses. Thank you very much, Minister. So we now move on to agenda item 5, where we continue our evidence sessions on artificial intelligence. And we're very pleased this morning to have two panels, the first of which consists of Dex Hunter-Torek, the Strategic Communications Advisor and former Head of Communications at SpaceX and current Head of Executive Communications at Facebook, and also Kayla Megan Burns, Tech Founder and Board Member at the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, both of whom are attending online this morning. I'd just like to begin by asking you both whether you think we're getting it right in terms of how we understand artificial intelligence and the skills that we seek to instill, both in terms of young people but also the wider population. I think much of the discussion is about essentially losing jobs and workers being displaced. And also, I also slightly shudder when my daughters come home from school telling me that they're being told that they must not use any AI whatsoever. And my sense is that actually what we should be doing is thinking about, well, what can you use AI for? What are the right sorts of questions, the right ways to use it? And indeed, for the wider workforce, how can we actually use this to maximise our skills, knowledge and expertise? I just wondered kind of what your views were on what should we be doing to give people the right skills to maximise the use of AI. Dex Hunter-Torek, I sort of noticed you nodding there. Can I bring you in on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for inviting me to join. I should just clarify as well, I'm no longer with Facebook, so I'm not currently working for them. In terms of skills, I think you're absolutely right in terms of wanting to recognize that actually there are useful things that students and young people can be doing with AI, which we should really be encouraging and figuring out the right framework to manage, as part of the education system. Just very candidly, I think there's probably very few students who are not using AI as part of doing all of their homework assignments, whether or not it's something that schools are permitting or encouraging. And so actually rethinking how do you, set homework, how do you assess student performance, I think that's really, really important to do in a world where these tools are just absolutely ubiquitous and young people are absolutely jumping in with both feet into the AI future. In terms of what those skills look like, I think part of it is absolutely thinking, how can you integrate AI usage into all parts of the curriculum? There is a plethora of different tools that are useful across subjects. These are all capabilities that are rapidly growing more and more sophisticated. And it's important that we rethink again how we're, establishing curricula, how we're assessing student performance, how are we getting, folks to really experiment with these things continuously. I think it's important, though, to also think about the broader societal context and how do we, create the kind of environment in which young people will want to be able to adopt these skills and be encouraged to go and develop these things. It's probably going to be by encouraging adoption and literacy of these skills at all age levels across society. And that's going to be really, really important, right, for a whole broader set of agenda items, which this committee is obviously very, very focused on. How do you build, a high growth competitive economy for the future? That is absolutely going to require very strong adoption and understanding of AI tools, in all sectors of the economy. And it's something which, honestly, there's very few ecosystems around the world which have really figured out the right strategies here. So it's something which I think is a much larger conversation about how do we drive that.
Good. Well, I think we'll be really interested in exploring the number of strands there that you've laid out. I just wondered if I could ask Kayla Megan Burns a similar question. I'm very mindful that my Deputy Convener, Michelle Thompson, would like to talk more in depth about the arts. But again, thinking about that skills question, potentially from a more artistic point of view. I mean, again, what sorts of skills should we be thinking about? And in your view, do you think the there are as many possibilities as there are risks to when you're thinking about artistic kind of considerations and the arts more generally?
So with the arts specifically, AI is really quite a double-edged sword. So, for example, I know many people who have had nothing to do with the arts prior to kind of large-scale commercial AI availability. So things like DALL-E and Midjourney, who have now jumped straight into the arts and are actively using it to support their careers and are making good livelihoods of it. So there's definitely opportunities there. And I think a really key skill set in that is just experimentation, innovation, not being afraid to get in and about these things, get it wrong a few times, and by doing that, figuring out how to get it right. So that's definitely a really, really huge part in it. The risk side, however, there is also substantial setbacks. So, for example, AI art, like digital design, that's a great area to look up in terms of AI. So, again, just as I know many people who have now made great livelihoods, for example, making AI ads and things like that, and are really utilising AI tools to, I suppose, speed up their processes, their creative processes, and bring things from conception straight through to like reality in a really, really fast timescale. There's also this setback for real artists who have existed in the industry for a long time. So, for example, previously, if you're going to set up a business, you might go to someone who does graphic design to sort out your logos and your brandings and things like that. And you'd maybe spend some money in that, talking probably in the region of hundreds of pounds, usually keeping it local, things like that. And that would be good for the economy. However, now with access to tools like Midjourney, like DALL-E, you don't need to spend that money, and it doesn't go to local artists. It doesn't go to people with those skill sets. Which is definitely a risk, because instead of going to those local artists, it's going into the pockets of, for example, OpenAI and tech giants like that. And we know that harms not only our local job markets, but also our economy, because for every pound that's spent locally, it can recirculate up to the value of £5. And that does not happen whenever it goes into tech giants. In terms of the creative industries, we've seen similar risks happen before, similar impacts happen before. Music was always kind of the canary in the coal mine with this. So, for example, previously we've seen the dawn of Napster and peer-to-peer file sharing, which really took a severe hit at revenues within the music industry between kind of 1999 and 2009, and then the same again whenever Spotify came along. And although Spotify was kind of the regulator for this peer-to-peer file sharing, it still had a massive impact on the music industry. And right now we're looking at that sort of thing with AI. So current projections estimate that 24% of music creators' revenues are at risk by 2028 due to AI-generated content, and that's the equivalent to about £8 billion of cumulative losses across 5 years. And that is escalating to more than £3 billion annually by 2028. Currently, over 33% of songs uploaded daily to platforms like Deezer are AI generated, and that's a really recent statistic. I think that report only came out maybe within this month, and that figure has tripled within the past 10 months, showing really rapid AI penetration of these markets. And yet people don't like it, which is the really stark thing. So, for example, 55% of UK adults express discomfort with the idea of accidentally consuming AI-generated music. 77% believe that unattributed AI compositions amount to theft or unjust use. But at the exact same time, 97% of listeners can't reliably distinguish AI music from human-generated music, human-created music. And that disconnect amplifies real risk of cultural dilution and economic displacement. Even whenever you think of our own RSNO, we've managed to bring Hollywood into Scotland, which is great, by producing film scores. And we've had really significant economic impact from that, which has been really, really exciting. There's £17.2 million in gross value added for Scotland this year, supporting over 300 jobs, including 500 freelancers, and I think it's £11.6 million throughout for wellbeing benefits as well. While that's great, there's a really big risk with AI. For example, with those film scores, if 97% of people can't tell the difference between AI and human-generated music, imagine how that number changes whenever you put it over a really impactful lightsaber scene. Because I think at that point, we're going to hit nearly 100% people aren't going to be able to tell, which is a real risk for here.
Great. Well, I'm very tempted to ask a whole raft of follow-up questions, but I think I would be probably in danger of copyright theft from my behalf of my fellow members, Michelle Thompson, Murdo Fraser, both of whom I think want to follow up on some of those points. So with that, I will actually hand over to Michelle and invite her to ask.
Good morning, both. It's an absolute privilege for both of you to give us some of your precious time this morning. Dex, I wanted to come in to you first. I mean, obviously, your hinterland is quite startling, and I know you've recently started working with Treasury. I wanted to get your kind of perception, given the kind of private sector career you've had thus far, coming in and engaging with the public sector. Our Scottish Government is working on an AI strategy and plan at the moment, and I suspect their challenges. What do they make the priority when everything feels like a priority, and also, and where you say yourself, and where AI integration is more than a technology? So what would your advice be to them?
Yeah, great question. That's the trillion-dollar question. So, you know, I think in terms of the strategy and the overall framework, there's a lot in there which is absolutely world-class. I think it's a, you know, very, very sound overall framework. The challenge, of course, will be, you know, executing against that and really doing it at the pace and scale you need to be competitive. The technology is maturing so fast now. And, you know, in a way, you know, the last 3 years of generative AI that we've seen, that is something which a lot of folks still haven't really adapted to. You know, I've seen, you know, numbers from the Office of National Statistics, which says that, you know, it's less than 20% of Scottish businesses that are actively using AI. The number's actually probably higher because a lot of employees are just using it, you know, in a sort of unofficial capacity, you know, on their personal devices. But certainly, you know, adoption rates generally are probably quite low. The next 2 to 3 years of AI are going to be vastly more sophisticated and transformative than what we've already seen. So, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that it's not even 3 years since ChatGPT arrived. That will be next week when the anniversary is of 3 years. And in that time, you've seen trillions, you know, of pounds of, you know, economic value added to the world economy. You know, there's pretty plausible analysis showing that if you take out AI and its impact on US economic growth, for example, the US economy is only growing by about 0.1% currently. So actually pretty much the entire economic, you know, growth, you know, in the US is being driven by AI. Very different ecosystem, of course, something that is highly dependent upon Silicon Valley, but it illustrates just that scale of value that is being created now. You know, what we're going to see in the next 2 to 3 years is systems that are arriving much faster, which will, again, be, you know, supremely transformative for those who are able to jump in quite quickly and harness those capabilities to rethink their organizational strategies, their culture, their leadership models, all of the, frankly, very human and analog things you need to go with the technology, and that I would say are, frankly, more challenging to implement than the technology. And yet, we will have very, very little time to adopt those before other ecosystems, you know, competitive, you know, economies, other companies will be, you know, looking to seize that advantage around the world. And so that very much intensified pace of competition, you know, and the entrant of new challengers in, you know, very established traditional industries, I think those are all things which should be of great concern to us and to policymakers, you know, honestly, in all ecosystems. Sam Altman, of course, the CEO of OpenAI, has made this famous prediction, over the last year, which, is the talk of the town in Silicon Valley, which is at some point in the next year, you will start to see the first billion-dollar companies which have a single employee because they're simply backed up by large amounts of very sophisticated AI, by AI agents. And we haven't got to that point yet, but we're certainly not far off. We've got companies that have only been around for a few years, which have, as little as a dozen employees, which have already, hit that billion-dollar valuation mark. You're probably going to see more companies, getting into that space. And the nature of AI is it offers extreme asymmetric advantages. So what do I mean by that? If you're a small company which is absolutely able to embrace those cutting-edge capabilities to really orient everything around, taking advantage of those tools, moving very, very quickly, you might be able to disrupt much larger, slower incumbents. And that's a huge opportunity for small businesses. I tell folks, including, Scottish small businesses, because I spend a lot of time in Scotland, there are no small businesses anymore. The smallness is entirely in our minds in this era. The same could be said for countries. There are no small countries in this environment. If you're able to really gear the ecosystem towards being ultra ambitious, figuring out how to integrate those capabilities quite quickly into the public and private sector, you can get, huge advantages in that competitive global landscape. But it also means that you're highly vulnerable to being challenged in the same way. It's just such a fast-moving ecosystem today.
Yeah, again, there's so much in your answer there. So working on the basis that almost whatever they do, it's already too late. There's almost a sense I hear from what you're saying, which is don't get in the way of the disruptors who will manage to make, the potential sole employee billion-dollar companies. But in terms of the public sector itself and utilisation of AI, there's obviously a much bigger consideration around trust, because obviously with some of the use cases that the public sector deals with, getting that wrong could have catastrophic consequences, not just in terms of the data, but in terms of trust in society and government and all that entails. I'd appreciate your thoughts on that as well.
Trust is absolutely critical. There's pretty good polling and analysis which has shown that the vast majority of consumers are actually pretty skeptical or afraid of AI. And it's well more than 50% of the population. The more that people learn about AI, the more afraid they become of it. It is not an educational problem. So there really is a sort of fundamental, problem of legitimacy and trust in technology. And that's obviously linked very closely to the way people perceive big tech as well, and the many sort of reputational and regulatory missteps that the industry has, had over the last, decade. It is something, though, where, in a way, separating big tech and, that piece from AI generally, which is, far more than big tech, and there's lots of systems that are being created by, innovators from small companies, including, pioneers based in Scotland. That is something that's really important to think about. And, absolutely, how can you be transparent about the ways in which AI is being used, how it's using people's data, while also illuminating just what are the really transformative applications of AI, what are the ways we can deliver improved public services for lower cost. I think that's going to be important so that you can then have a reasonable mainstream public conversation about what do we want to use these technologies for. And there's all sorts of applications for different types of AI as well, which I think very few people are probably going to think actually they are extraordinarily controversial. There are things which, they add incremental but important value to the way in which we deliver services. They don't necessarily involve making use of a lot of very interesting data. Perfect example, right? There's cities all over Europe and all over the world which have been using machine learning systems for years now to optimize the flow of traffic through cities and to cut congestion, linking into the traffic light system, figuring out how to optimize timing of those cameras so you can move traffic around. That is not a new capability. That is very, very established. And that's the sort of thing where, most people, when they learn, there are perfectly well-tested, proven strategies for dramatically cutting congestion flows and decreasing the amount of time that you have car engines idling, which then also leads to improved air quality and helps you meet your environmental targets. That's something people say, sign me up. On the other hand, there's also, applications in, the healthcare system where there's much greater sensitivity naturally. It's something where there isn't necessarily a clear right or wrong approach. There's just lots of different approaches with a lot of grey. And there we really do need to have a conversation about what is it people are comfortable with.
And there's probably lots of follow-on questions, but I'm going to bring Kayla in just now. Kayla, you were referencing some statistics earlier. I know where the ones came from in terms of the RSNO's economic contribution report, because obviously we held an event last week in the Parliament for that. But the earlier statistics were useful, first of all, just to know where they came from, just for our records.
So there was recently a report released by Deezer, which is a music streaming platform, and those were the stats around the amount of songs uploaded to those platforms that are AI generated. There's previous reports that brought reports together from different platforms about where those songs were shared, and there's further reports specifically about the consumer attitudes towards AI music. More than happy to share all of the links to those reports after the committee thought would be useful.
Thank you very much for that. So obviously you're here. I think the RSNO has been very leading in putting you on the board, given the kind of concerns that many creatives have about AI. But I think it'd be useful to kind of flesh out a wee bit of which sector in the creative arts where the most concerns are. So obviously RSNO has done a tremendous amount. I've seen the uptake in their live kind of performances and audiences. And you correctly point out they've done some marvellous stuff with recording their sort of film studio in Nuremberg recently and so on. But there is something about the authenticity of live music. So therefore, how do you see AI being able to be integrated to actually enhance a kind of service offering, if you like, of something like a live orchestra like the RSNO? In other words, what sort of ideas are you bringing to the board of the RSNO in terms of how they might be able to get ahead of the game, if you like? We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. No, I've lost the meeting. So I think what's really interesting is previously you could have separated out the creative industries into, the music industry, into, physical art and things like that. But now with the AI era, actually, I feel like that's becoming less and less useful. There are still some differences in context. So, for example, now with AI-generated music, you can't really tell the difference. That's having a massive impact. But with AI-generated art, that's also that you're seeing that same impact across a different field. So previously, where music was kind of the canary in the coal mine, like we've seen with Napster, like we've seen with Spotify, that's no longer the case. We're seeing impacts happen straight across the board in the creative industries, all simultaneously, all at the same time. I think where music is a little bit different is, as you mentioned, with those live performances. Nothing can replace humans in that respect. Absolutely nothing can replace humans in that respect. It is about a shared experience. It is a cultural experience. And actually something that I think is a real opportunity in this era is to generate a more diverse cultural experience. So right now, all kind of publicly available information has been scraped by AI training models. All high-quality data sets have already been scraped. That's already been exhausted. There is no information that is publicly available online that is of high quality that hasn't yet been touched. All of that's gone. And unfortunately, that includes all of our artistic works. And no creators have been compensated for their works being used in these models, which is obviously quite significant across the board. But where there is a real opportunity is that now for these training models, now for this training data, what the most valuable thing for these systems is diverse training data, edge cases, extreme cases, unusual data, things that you wouldn't normally come across. And I think in Scotland we're in a really fortunate position there, because we have fantastic artistic institutions. And on top of that, we also have things like the Gaelic language, which can't be overlooked, because again, that's a minority language on a global scale, which is incredibly useful in terms of training data, but also important culturally. So actually, I think that we're in a really interesting position right now, where we can actually, by investing in our arts and culture, we're also simultaneously investing in AI, because rather than, you know, the arguments where we can sit there and go, oh, okay, well, we need to support local artists because AI can't take over, or, you know, AI makes things more accessible to get things done quicker, therefore we should be investing in that, rather than having that as rather than having those two things oppose each other. Actually, they can really complement each other. And I think in Scotland, we're really uniquely positioned to do that, which could be really, really dramatic. As well, it gives us opportunities instead of competing head-to-head, for example, in infrastructure, which is really high capex, energy heavy, would involve us changing our energy systems, and it would be a multi-year thing. Investing in our arts now in order to get that kind of training data for AI not only would diversify musicians' incomes and artists' incomes, but also which will of course have well-being impacts as well, because the music industry has been torn apart, in particular over the past few years. You know, median self-reported income for self-releasing artists in 2019 was under £13,000 annually, with 47% earning less than £10,000 per year. And that has serious mental health impacts. So by investing in our arts, we wouldn't only be, you know, enhancing arts and culture, but also enhancing our well-being, but also giving us that really unique relationship with AI training data by producing those edge cases as well. And there's really good examples of that being done, for example, with Ireland's basic income scheme for the arts. And although that hasn't been linked up to AI, I think that it's a fantastic opportunity right there to do that. And that's seen fantastic economic returns when done in Ireland. Over 3 years, I think they supported over 2,000 artists, and that's now been made into a permanent scheme. Definitely something which I think is low risk but high reward.
Again, there's so much that we could unpick in here, and I think that's our challenge with such a short, sharp focus series of sessions. I suppose it's a reflection again from both of you. I'd like to get probably about 10 years ago, when I was in Westminster, we talked about AI. And I remember having a session with a professor from Cambridge University who at that point, and it seemed unbelievable at that point, how many lawyers and accountants and these kind of base functions were going to be taken out. And we know that to be true now. But I said to him, but who, or rather what skill set is going to inherit the earth? And his answer was, well, it will be the creatives, because the creatives will keep on creating no matter what, and they will harness the power of AI to endlessly create, and that will be the merging. And that's always stuck me, and I'd appreciate both your reflections then, if you believe that's true, and what that means in terms of how we fundamentally shape the provisioning of really everything from a kind of governance perspective. So I'll come back to you, Dex, and then finish with you, Kayla, and that'll be me, convener.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with that, philosophy. There's all sorts of things which people assign, intangible value to, because that simply reflects a set of societal preferences and values. Every bit of research we have tells us that wine stores better in bottles with screw caps, and yet overwhelmingly consumers prefer wine that comes with a cork because it feels like it's a more premium product, even though it actually generally tastes less good than if you have a screw cap. We're in a moment now where you absolutely can generate very compelling, high quality creative work with AI systems across any medium. And, we're likely to see at some point in the next, 12 to 18 months, somebody generate an entire full-length Hollywood quality film, on their personal computer using AI. And this is something that, Hollywood absolutely is worrying a lot about. Will people feel that type of content is worthy of recognition in the same way as work created by real artists? I think not. I was traveling through Edinburgh Airport a few weeks ago, and I, wandered into the gift shop, and I noticed there was a whole bunch of AI-generated art that was on sale, sort of, souvenirs on a stand. And I felt really sad about it because, of course, Scotland has infinite numbers of fantastic artists, and instead you have this garbage that was created, probably in about 5 seconds using some, piece of AI, software, and did not reflect at all the creativity of the Scottish art scene. I just thought that's a bit of a wasted opportunity. What tourist is going to go in there and buy some AI slop? You could have obviously offered something really valuable and given artists a platform there, to offer something that's quite memorable, which you'd want to take home. In terms of the overall, picture of skills, 10 years ago, I vividly remember, because I was based in Silicon Valley, there was a huge debate amongst my colleagues about what are the skills we should be encouraging people to, learn, young people, so they're more resilient in the future economy. And the consensus from a lot of people was you should get young people to go and learn to code. You should push people towards STEM-related subjects, because of a future that's increasingly shaped by technology would require a lot more people to have those skills. And I actually pretty strongly disagree with that. And I'd like to think with the passage of time, actually, my position has been very strongly borne out. Machines are very good at coding. We've got AI systems that are coming from Google DeepMind, obviously based in London, which now outperform more than 93% of programmers who are so good they take part in competitive coding contests. And you're on a trajectory where, absolutely the vast majority of code will be generated by machines, probably autonomously or almost entirely autonomously in just the next few years. And so what are the things that we should be investing in? What are the things that are likely to make us more resilient for longer in a future with systems like that? It's not just creativity. It's going to be having talent that is genuinely interdisciplinary, that is multi-domain in its expertise. The challenges of a future that is more interconnected and moving faster than ever will be very much, about a whole bunch of different problems all appearing all at once. And what you're seeing now is companies who are on the forefront of adapting their culture and their organizations and their leadership to AI. They're starting to recognize the future will probably belong to a new set of business leaders and managers who actually don't belong to a narrow existing band of roles. So right now you've got people who are, marketers, and you've got public policy experts, and you've got project managers, and you've got legal. And 10, 15 years from now, there'll probably be a whole bench of folks who are operating across all of those disciplines all at once, who are, multifaceted in their skill sets, able to solve problems across all of those areas very, very quickly, because they're all backed up by world-class AI systems, which will be the very best experts in all of those categories. And so you want people who are genuinely creative, not, in a narrowly artistic way, but genuinely able to figure out how to solve problems, working across all of those areas very, very quickly with a lot of context that probably doesn't confine itself to a single traditional academic subject area or professional domain.
Yeah, and the same question to yourself, Kayla, as well. Thank you very much, Dex.
So I actually couldn't agree with what Dex is saying any more than that. I think there has been, I find it quite comical now, if I'm being honest, because over the past, quite a few years, over a decade for sure, there has been a real undermining of the value of things like arts and creativity in favour of real studies and real jobs like coding and hard STEM subjects. And ironically, now with AI, we are seeing jobs that are being cut in coding with an increased demand for things like philosophers. because now we're in this era where actually we really need those types of skills. Ethics is going to be an absolutely huge area, because right now with things like OpenAI, with things like Anthropic, creating those guardrails of how we use AI, what it's allowed to do and how we can interact with it, that's what's decided as safe and right is decided by a few people within these tech giants. And that is on a global scale, where these tools are being used globally, and these right and wrongs and what's safe and what's unsafe and what's allowed and what's not allowed is being decided totally independent of the cultural context in which these tools are being used in. So there's real space for that right now, and that's something that I'm very, very conscious of. In terms of skills, I'm so conscious, as Dex has mentioned, about kind of funneling young people down a narrow track, getting them to specify too early and putting them into, really narrow fields like, okay, well, you are going to do, computer programming. That's going to be your thing. And there's a real concern, a real disillusion as well with young people, because they have been told this is the track. You do well in school, you get into university, then you go and you get a good job, and you climb your way up the ladder, and you do it by getting, you'll do your best by getting by doing STEM subjects and working in areas like that. And if anything has been proven true by this area, by this new AI era, is that paradigm is totally and utterly false. We're seeing so many young people being offered inappropriate jobs, being severely underemployed, being unemployed. And we are seeing a severe amount of jobs being cut, especially at entry levels, because those are the easiest jobs to get AI to do. Now, that's going to leave us with a massive skills gap, where we have people who have been well experienced and are able to, for example, quality check the work that AI systems are doing. So, for example, if an AI system is autonomously coding, you will have a human who is qualified to look at that code, check it, and make sure that it runs correctly and fix any issues within it. That will tend to be someone more senior within the organisation. That won't be a grad. So what is happening with these grad jobs? I think we need much tighter links with industry rather than this very tight, narrow track of education and then into a grad job, because that is clearly not fit for purpose right now, never mind what we're going into within the next few years.
Right, thank you. I'll hand back to the convener. Thank you very much, both convener.
Thank you. First of all, can I just say to Kayleigh Megan, as somebody who graduated with a degree in philosophy 26 years ago, thank you very much for validating my educational choices. Can I just ask Dex a brief supplementary question? So, I am interested by kind of the notion that essentially AI tips kind of economies of scale on their head. I wonder if I could just ask you, how far do you take the points that you set out? I mean, to what extent will we see in 20 years essentially organisations just being one person that just configuring AI tools around them, or to what extent? I mean, just how far does that? I mean, I absolutely accept you will see businesses like that, but will all businesses be like that? Or what does a sort of a sensible organisation look like, both in terms of size, but more critically in terms of configuration, in your view, if you were is it about how well you specify? So again, taking the coding example, to get the good code out the AI, you still need to give it the right specification. Is that what kind of the core function of an organisation will be? So how far will it go? And what will the functions at the heart of organisations be that seek to use AI?
Yeah, so unsatisfyingly, we don't know how far it will go. I think in general, though, we can expect that organisations across the board will generally become much leaner in terms of human employees. And so, right now, you look at some of the companies that require the largest workforces, they tend to be doing things with a lot of physical infrastructure, logistics, supply chain, manufacturing. These are all areas where you're also seeing huge advancements in robotics. So, where previously you'd have had a warehouse which employed hundreds of people, those numbers are absolutely, dropping, very, very quickly. And you're seeing in some cases almost fully automated, facilities. And certainly that is where the future is going. You're already seeing the movement within a large number of organizations, including in the UK and big employers, to begin reducing the size of new talent, pipelines. We've seen double-digit falls in certain roles that are being recruited as new graduate roles, in consultancy and accountancy and other, sort of previously quite stable professional, avenues. So I think it's something where we don't fully know how far it goes. There will obviously still be a value in having scale, in particular areas, but particularly for knowledge work, where you aren't necessarily relying upon having a lot of, infrastructure, this might be something where you end up with really, really condensed organizations that are having sort of dramatically outsized impact. And, it's something which I think a lot of companies have yet to fully fathom just how transformative that might be. The examples about the impact on artistic and creative jobs, absolutely spot on. We're seeing, a lot of small agencies in particular just shedding a lot of their workers because honestly, one or two people now backed up by a lot of AI can probably do what 10 or 20 people would have previously been required to do with that. So it is going to be extraordinarily challenging, I think, as we see that transition unfolding.
I'd like to hand over to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Dex, the point you just made is what I was going to ask about, which is what it means for the workforce. Because we were looking last week at a report that just came out from Microsoft at the sort of jobs that might suffer from development of AI. And in the top 5 was writers and authors. And I suppose my question is, what does this mean for human creativity? Where will the role in future be for original human-created output? And is AI effectively just derivative on the work humans have done? And if we're squeezing humans out of the picture, what does that mean? Does that mean we just won't have innovation in the future?
Yeah, so, I think, so first of all, AI is absolutely not just derivatory. And while that might once have been true, just based on the sort of crude AI systems that existed, maybe 5-10 years ago, which sounds like it was quite recent, but that is a lifetime, obviously, in the industry. Now we're in a moment where AI systems are actually generating things that, combined with human expertise, are absolutely transformative. So, perfect example, we are experiencing the largest boom in scientific discovery ever in history. And there's very compelling research showing exactly how the impact of generative AI systems is turbocharging the ability of scientists to do their work. I've looked at research, which has, been peer reviewed, showing that, scientists who use fully, generative AI optimized workflows, they're publishing about 60% more papers every year than their colleagues. They're getting promoted faster. They're getting 3 times more citations. You're just seeing this huge explosion now of different, discoveries across any number of domains. And obviously, where does new technology come from? It starts in the lab, it comes from science, and then it gets commercialized. It then becomes things which impact our day-to-day lives. So, that's something where, that would not be possible without AI. It is something that, people on their own, do not have that kind of, cognitive power to deliver, in this way, certainly at this scale. It is something, though, which will be extraordinarily challenging for societies. And in a way, I think you hit the nail on the head, right, which is what exactly will be the impact on people's creativity? What will be the impact on people generally? And what are people for? There's a whole bunch of unanswered questions, for the future that's not that far off. And I actually don't think it's 20 years, unfortunately. All of the world's most valuable technology companies today, the trillion-plus juggernauts, they are officially committed 100% towards achieving AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is essentially human-level intelligence in machines. And that is not something we are anywhere close to right now. All of the systems we have right now are quite crude in comparison. Almost all of the major AI lab leaders believe that we will reach AGI in the next decade. And some believe we will achieve it much sooner than that. And so there is a world coming where actually these systems will, not just on the arts and creativity, but across the entire expanse of the economy, might end up really excelling and at least matching or potentially vastly superseding the performance of people. And that is something which no society is prepared for at all. And so I do actually strongly believe these are things that we need to begin taking seriously. If we want growth 10 or 20 years from now, which is no time at all, it requires us to be doing a whole bunch of things right now to prepare for that future. And this is something which will be dramatically greater and more challenging than any previous technological transition our societies have faced.
Thanks very much for that. I think you're probably not helping very much in giving us answers, but maybe you are helping at least us ask the right questions. So that's progress at least. So thank you, thank you for that. Can I turn to Dex? Turn to Kayla Megan and ask a similar question, but perhaps put it more in the context of music, and whether you have similar concerns about how do we create original music in the future if AI will just do it better.
So I'm going to come in with a very controversial statement and say that I don't believe that we have been creating a particularly significant amount of original music for, at this point, decades. Because of the commercial trends, this has been studied in multiple papers, and again, I'm more than happy to provide them after the committee. But multiple studies have shown that our music has become simpler, more repetitive, and actually in some cases more violent as well, more exploitative, but much more simple and more repetitive because of commercial pressures. So in order to get that number one hit, in order to get something that's going to be put on the radio, which will actually perhaps make some money in an industry which is really struggling for people to survive while just by living in this industry, these commercial pressures have really, really limited creativity over the past few decades, and that has been documented really, really thoroughly. So actually, I really do believe that we're on the edge of a creative renaissance, and AI is going to help us achieve that. I do think that it's going to change our entire perception of the arts and the value within the arts, because as I've mentioned before, the market's shifting from kind of that mass scraping to licensed and curated data sets. Major deals have happened now between AI firms and music majors, for example, like Suno and Sony, Udio and Universal, whereas previously there was just litigation cases for unfair use due to scraping of their music data sets. Whenever I say data sets, I do mean art, I do mean music, I do mean creative achievements. There was a very interesting ruling in a German court very, very recently. I don't know if you will have seen it, but it found that OpenAI's ChatGPT had illegally harvested copyrighted song lyrics, affirming that online creative works are protected by copyright law and can't be freely used for AI training without permission. Now, what's really interesting is that has already happened. Again, as I mentioned previously, all publicly available works have already been scraped, which means that this ruling is a really, really interesting precedent to set, because that means that effectively they have violated copyright by doing that. And that does mean that will apply across various, like practically all AI companies which have used that scraping strategy rather than using ethically curated data sets. What that does mean, though, is that, again, these diverse edge cases and culturally rich data sets, they don't just add value for AI models to improve output quality and inclusivity, but they're also really, really valuable for our economy, for our people, for our arts. We've seen really interesting cases where, for example, creatives in London, I forget the name of the firm, is it Bronze? I will again get that to you after the committee, but they partnered with, they used AI combined with some artists, and they created music which changes every single time that you listen to it. So it's a really experiential piece. It's really different than what we would typically experience. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of those things, because AI can produce, anyone can produce anything like of relatively good quality very easily with AI, in terms of music, in terms of art, in terms of, to be honest, most things, apps and things like that as well nowadays. What's going to stick out, what's going to be attention grabbing is on unusual and unique things that AI perhaps wouldn't achieve alone, that does involve elements of human creativity, and that is where our strengths are going to be. Again, we've seen this sort of thing before, albeit on a smaller scale, with, for example, peer-to-peer file sharing. It was thought to, there was all sorts of things being said about it at the time, saying that it was going to kill the music industry because no one would get paid for creating art. Now, that didn't happen. We now have artists who are entirely broke, living on very, very little money, but they're still actively creating. I don't think that anything is going to stop humans creating. It's part of our human nature. It's how do we protect that, and how do we do it in an ethical and sustainable way? And I think that that's going to be really, really challenged, and I hope that a creative renaissance will be part of that.
Thanks very much. That's quite an optimistic outlook, which is good to hear. Can I just follow up on one point you made about protecting intellectual property, which I think is something really interesting for us to look at. I can ask AI to produce me a piece of music in the style of, say, Beethoven, and it will do that. Beethoven's long dead; he's long out of copyright, so there's no IP issues. If I ask AI to produce me a piece of music in the style of, say, Lewis Capaldi, it will do that too. But Lewis Capaldi is still with us, and he's still producing music, and his music is protected. How does Lewis Capaldi protect his brand when anybody can produce a song that sounds just like him? You're muted. Yeah, we can hear you now. That's fine. Yeah.
Perfect. There are multiple steps that need to be taken, and I don't think anything that's been proposed so far actually takes enough steps. So Lewis Capaldi is a fantastic example to take. Obviously, he is wonderful. He is Scottish. We are great. It's great that we have him. But also, there are many artists that aren't Lewis Capaldi within Scotland, and they are being sorely missed in all of these arguments, even though that's a really vital part of our arts and of our creative industry. So obviously there are protections that need to be in place across the board, regardless of the arts. So that is protections for your likeness, your face, your voice, all of that, all of those need to be protected. And that's not just from an artistic perspective, but also from a security perspective, so that no one can just create an AI avatar of me and come along to this committee and say things in my voice that I wouldn't say, represent my views in a way that I wouldn't represent them. So that's important, not just in the arts, but across the level. But specifically going into the arts, there are various things that we need. And I think one of the first things that we need is transparency that enables identification of whenever works are actually used. So right now, the EU requires AI companies to summarise training data by category. The UK is considering similar approaches to this, but neither of those approaches actually helps independent creators identify whether their works were actually used in these data sets. It's too vague, it's too broad. You can't look at this information and go, okay, well, that's me in there, that's my art, I was used. So we need binding requirements for AI developers to maintain searchable work-by-work registries, or at minimum provide audit access to creators who suspect that their work was included. As without this, things like opt-outs are meaningless because creators can't identify what they're opting out of, and licensing therefore becomes really, really impossible. Second to that, we need a kind of centralised licensing infrastructure designed for individual creators, not just intermediaries. So the music sector has seen licensing deals between major labels and AI companies. So that's your Sonys, your Universal Music Groups. They have started happening, and that is protecting the likes of your Lewis Capaldis, your Taylor Swift, your Ed Sheerans. Those deals are being made on a large scale, but unfortunately all of our independent creators are being left out in the cold and to fend for themselves, which isn't remotely feasible. So we need a statutory requirement that any licensing revenue negotiated through industry bodies includes a distribution mechanism for the independent creators, one that doesn't require formal collective membership, such as through a label. This could be a statutory licensing pool where independent creators opt in and receive allocations proportional to their content's use and training. The third thing that I think that we need is an enforcement capacity that doesn't require individual litigation, because that is what we're stuck with right now. If an independent creator discovers their work was scraped without authorization, they currently must fund their own lawsuit against well-resourced AI companies, which is such an aggressive uphill battle. And people just aren't capable of doing that. Therefore, we should establish a statutory right to small claims, copyright adjudication for infringement claims under, for example, £50,000, with UK courts empowered to award attorney fees to prevailing creators. This shifts the enforcement burden from individual creators to the legal system itself. Now, each of these three things that I've mentioned, as well as the protection for voice, image, etc., it's really important to recognise that these frameworks wouldn't actually apply retrospectively. So we still have this massive issue of the artists whose portfolios were used to train ChatGPT and other AI models between, the past, for example, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, because currently there's no recourse for that. Something like a one-time remediation mechanism, perhaps a statutory fund financed by AI companies for retroactive use to establish historical use matters and not just future protections, is also really important, because this is a massive gap that we have right now.
Okay, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about there, and actually some very helpful ideas as to what changes need to be made in a policy perspective to protect original content. So that's been very useful. So thank you.
Thank you. I believe the Deputy Commissioner would like to make a brief supplementary.
Yeah, Kayla, it's just a sort of tiny point, which I don't want to take too much time on, but is the issue not even more complex than that with music, in that you can, as you've explained, everything's been scraped, but you can create entirely new pieces made up of the best of the rest, if you like. So if I could sit and listen to Mahler 5, for example, and I could tell you in the trumpet solo in the opening which trumpet player it is, and I could listen to Nessun Dorma and tell you which tenor is singing the top C, whether it's Pavarotti or Domingo or Kaufman or so on. And you could basically splice the best of the rest. So it's not as simple, surely, as just taking an artist in a song or whatever. You could actually create something note by note with key thematics.
100%, like 100%. And that's why it's really important for AI companies to have those databases and track what's actually in there and how it's being used. So, for example, in a piece, is there a guitar piece that is used, or a rhythmic thing that's being used in a Taylor Swift song that then comes up and is used? 0.8% of it is then being used in this AI-generated output. We need systems that are able to track the usage of these pieces, so not only tracking what's going into them, but also how they're being used in these AI systems. We are seeing really interesting developments in those areas. So, for example, we have the C2PA, which is a collaborative effort led by, for example, Adobe, but also endorsed by the likes of Google, Apple, etc., to track who owns what, essentially. So, for example, right now we have the YouTube ID, which does what it says in the tin. But essentially it would be like assigning something like a YouTube ID to every single piece of art that exists in an invisible way. So that you can track how it's being used, where it appears in these systems, and proportionally how much of it's being used. And that is really, really important that we're able to do that, so that appropriate compensation mechanisms and attribution can be assigned. That is a tricky technical issue, but actually we're seeing a lot of progress on that front. And again, I think using the technical efforts required as an excuse not to do these things, I think, is a relatively poor effort considering the era that we're in. We're seeing a lot of these developments. The fact that this can be done doesn't mean that we shouldn't. The fact that it's challenging doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done, especially for the state of our arts, for appropriate attribution of arts, and yeah, the well-being of our culture going forward.
I'd like to bring in Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've talked a lot this morning about copyright, but obviously with AI there are concerns from the public about misinformation, built-in bias, privacy violation, data harvesting, and then when you think about the situation, the economic situation that Dex outlined earlier on about the whole swathe of jobs that could be undermined by AI, there's a huge economic impact in any country if this comes along. And not to mention the fact that the International Energy Agency has identified that energy consumption for data centres could be 1.5% of global electricity consumption. So, given that governments aren't very fleet of foot, we've had AI for 30 years, but ChatGPT's only been around since the 30th of November 2022. What regulations need to be brought in, and what should the focus of any government regulation be? And I'll come to Dex first.
So there's probably vast amounts of different types of regulation you're going to need, including both national and global architectures for managing a bunch of these problems. All of these technologies and the nature of most of these challenges are, very international. They're not things that most countries are going to be able to manage through any combination of purely domestic levers. But, in terms of the sort of broad buckets in which you need to think about, what is a public framework for responding, absolutely there's the economic disruption that will unfold, the nature of how these systems will impact existing jobs and industries. There's the geopolitical environment and, the fact that we probably don't have anywhere near as sufficient as is required, a real international framework for figuring out some of the common solutions we need for managing these challenges. You talked about disinformation. Many of the disinformation challenges we're facing are, of course, taking place on platforms that are, controlled by American companies, operating in, very different regulatory frameworks with very different political, impulses. There's no solution here unless multiple countries and governments are able to work together on tackling these problems in a much larger way. Simply put, most countries are not going to have leverage against the platforms to really lead to meaningful change in the way they approach, content decisions. You absolutely have a whole bucket of challenges relating to resource consumption, and energy usage. These are all things, again, where obviously they're part of that global fight against climate change, which is going very, very poorly indeed. And, there's a lot of attention paid to the resource consumption of AI itself. The IEA stats, are spot on. Those are things that are very alarming. The bigger one that I think not enough attention has been paid to is just very simply every conventional thesis about the value of AI is it might potentially allow our economies to grow. That is the promise of it. That is why you are seeing the hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in training and all of these systems and the vast infrastructure. If that happens, resource consumption by our societies will continue to grow. And at the pace where, we're consuming resources with the kinds of environmental impacts, that is unlikely to lead to a situation where we are able to meet our climate change goals. In fact, we'll get further and further away from that and could end up in a situation where we destabilize, actually parts of Earth's climate systems, which are already very, very frail. And then you have that whole bucket of societal challenges, right? Obviously, I think everyone in the room is probably thinking through, the nature of the migration crisis. We're in a, world where potentially, in the coming decades, you're going to see a lot of different countries and economies becoming increasingly uncompetitive in the face of those ecosystems which really are able to optimize for this future with these kinds of technological tools. And the ecosystems that are no longer competitive, they're not just going to see plateauing economic growth, they're likely to see, systems that are in full retreat, where you then have that corresponding rise in political populism and, an overall model for societies that may not be workable. And so what does the regulation look like? I mean, there's a whole bunch of individual strands we can look at in any of those buckets. But I think broadly, we need to think about those categories and recognize, obviously, what is realistic, within our jurisdiction to, drive ourselves. What are the conversations it's worth simply putting our hands up and saying, this is something that we need to have a real conversation about, involving leaders from multiple governments and pretty quickly, because right now there is just a large missing conversation on a number of those pieces.
Point about multi-governments having that conversation. I mean, obviously the UK is no longer part of the EU, but is there any jurisdictions or organisations like the EU that are looking at this issue and have in play legislation that would be helpful for us to learn from?
I mean, yeah, actually, I think there's multiple governments within the EU which have been, looking at these issues, and doing a lot of things which are very impressive. Again, there's probably a much larger holistic set of conversations which knit together action across those big domains I talked about, which is missing. But, you look at, countries like Estonia, right? With their leadership, in e-government, the kinds of investments in, technological literacy. Very, very impressive, which has allowed Estonia to really build up a position of global leadership in the way it's harnessing some of those cutting edge technologies to deliver citizen services. When it comes to AI, you have obviously very, hungry, innovative ecosystems around the world. South Korea has, been deploying technologies, for many years now, which, are things we don't even have now in the UK or in Scotland. And so it's worth absolutely looking to how a number of other ecosystems are taking elements of these tools and transforming parts of their system to account for it. South Korea just passed probably the most ambitious education transformation, set of proposals in the world for the AI era in just the last few months. Major investment, I believe over $700 million into their education system in order to equip every student with AI-powered textbooks to provide true personalized learning at scale for the AI era. And that is absolutely something which I expect will be, simply par for the course when it comes to any world-class education system in the next few years. So these are things we should definitely be looking at.
Thanks very much. A question for Kayla. You mentioned that you thought that there was a requirement for guardrails and we needed protections in place. Could you maybe elaborate on what you see the role of government in regulation, given some of the information we've received from DEX?
Yeah, so what I'm really conscious of, and even I was speaking to people about this last night from Anthropic, currently we don't understand how AI models work. They are black boxes. How they make decisions, we don't know, which means how do we know that they're safe? How do we know what guardrails are actually needed? And also, who gets to decide what is safe, what is right, what is wrong? Currently, those decisions do primarily just sit within these tech companies. And that's an unreasonable concentration of power, considering how widely these devices are used globally. Now, what I'm really conscious of as well is actually, we've spoke a lot about consumer-facing AI, but I'm conscious that this has only been spoken about generally in terms about how it's already present with us. We're kind of missing that horizon of what this is going to look like in the coming years. Right now, consumer-facing AI is generally confined within chatbots. However, leading AI companies have indicated that they'll be moving away from this and bringing AI not just into smart devices, but also directly off screens and onto our bodies, for example, into our surrounding environments. This will be an era of ambient computing that we're entering into, and that's really not entered any of the global conversations in the way that it should have just yet. Whenever you consider the impacts that things like these have had, so our smartphones, particularly on young people and more vulnerable populations, this should be particularly alarming because we don't know how these systems work. There are dark patterns, for example, and ways that we can be manipulated without necessarily knowing it. And the guardrails, how we operate around that, the safety for that. We're not at risk of replicating, for example, screen addiction again, as we did, whenever, for example, infinite scrolling, social media and smart devices, smartphones, in the way that they currently exist. We're not at risk of replicating that again. We're at risk of inventing something much worse. So I'm very, very, very conscious that actually we need to get really ahead of that, and that discussion isn't currently on the table. These devices, for example, they could not only adapt to our schedule, our environment, our routines, but also potentially, for example, our neurotypes, how we process information. And again, there's really fantastic opportunity here if this is used right, for example, to democratise access to information. So whether you are a dyslexic banker or whether you are a bibliophile that is totally and utterly petrified by numbers, you should be able to access the exact same information to the exact same standard, because it will be able to be adapted to how you process information. It'll be able to be presented in formats which are the most appropriate for you so that you can consume this. And that is a fantastic opportunity in terms of, for example, as Dex mentioned, in terms of learning, personalised textbooks and things like that. That is amazing, as well as increasing accessibility. There's fantastic potential there, but there is also a serious risk of exploitation, for example, as biometric data, particularly things like unconscious eye movements. So I'm sure you're fully aware of things like smart glasses, which have recently come into play. They have cameras on the inside which track your eye movements. Now, eye movements are a subconscious thing. We might not necessarily be aware of exactly what our eyes are looking at. These cameras on the inside are able to track our eye movements, correlate to what we're looking at on the outside, and therefore could potentially use that against us, and use that to, for example, advertise against our subconscious, which is a real invasion of privacy on an entirely undiscovered level. Currently, that isn't allowed. However, I have been recently speaking to people at Meta who are working in these areas, and the processes currently for these types of innovation go in terms of prototyping, building use cases for it, and then going to market. There isn't the pauses for what are the potential ethical implications for this, what does this look like, how will this impact people in day-to-day use. That isn't there, and I think that really needs to be a much more significant role. That being said, I'm very conscious that particularly within the Scottish ecosystem, we do tend to be very anti-risk, very risk-adverse, and are very fond of setting up barriers to give a false sense of security. So we need to be really careful about walking that line, about inhibiting. We don't want to inhibit any innovation. We want to make sure that we're able to make the best use of these new innovations which are coming along, because there are fantastic applications, but at the same time, we need to be really conscious of potential implications. I would have looked ridiculous if I would have come into you 5-10 years ago and gone, actually, we need to really look at copyright for the arts. And we need to make sure that if anyone scrapes information online, that can be tracked and that people can be compensated for it. If I would have come in and said that to the committee 5 years ago, 7 years ago, people generally would have been looking at me and going, that's very unrealistic, we don't need to do that. Now I think we're sitting in a similar situation with, for example, biometric data and AI as these devices move from screens onto skin. And that's something I'm really aware of. We're talking about personal implications on personal levels as well as societal levels on scales which could put, for example, Cambridge Analytica, those scandals to shame. And this isn't a scaremonger. I am an AI optimist. I am a big believer in AI. I think it can do fantastic things. And I definitely don't think that we should be shying away from it. We're not there with these issues yet, but it is 100% on the horizon, and it's not something I've been seeing brought up into the conversation as much as it should have. So it is really important that we tackle these problems before they become widespread and prolific.
Okay, thanks very much, the panel, and I'll pass back to the convener.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning, Dex. Kayla, from my perspective, I would just like to invite you to say perhaps a few words each on the ethical side of all of this. Kayla, you've mentioned ethics a few times, and there clearly a number of issues have been raised around the table by colleagues that perhaps take us in that direction. Could you give us your thoughts about how do we protect ourselves and society and instill within the AI revolution some kind of sense of responsibility, some kind of sense of ethical behaviour and so on and so forth? Or is it destined to just run its own course in its own direction and at its own pace, do you think? Kayla, would you start, please?
So, again, this is something I really want to stress. I don't want to see hindered innovation. You know, I don't think that we should be setting up guardrails, which were extreme processes, which will delay innovation or hinder innovation, because this era is coming. The AI era is here. The next era of, for example, ambient computing is thoroughly on its way. I would expect that we'll start to see things like that within the next year or so, within 2026 and on from there. But I think it's really important that this is done for a common good. And I think that we will need to change a lot within our systems in order to achieve that. So, for example, that will be looking at changing things of what do we commercially reward? You know, will we just let, for example, those who have scraped the most data, will we let them be the winners because they did that first before it was ethically wrong, before we knew that it was an ethical problem, and therefore let them proceed on unhindered? Or will we reward ethical behaviours? And I think there needs to be a lot of commercial mechanisms in order to do that, because right now industry is going towards, right, let's do this as fast as we can. We need to be the first. We need to be the most innovative. It doesn't really matter how we get there. We're not going to do the ethical testing first because we need to see if people will use it. We need to get it into the markets before that happens, which means that we are waiting for the next scandal. We are waiting for the development of things like screen addictions. And actually, I think that there's a really important role within our societies. For example, neurodiversity is something which has really, really come up a lot and really come into the public zeitgeist within the past few years. We're much more aware of neurodiversity now than we were, for example, even 5 years ago. What we know, what we can hypothesise from our understandings of neurodiversity is that, and how they interact with technology, is that these people tend to exhibit extreme behaviours faster. So these actually could be our lead users for a lot of this. Rather than treating neurodiverse populations as vulnerable populations that need to be protected, we can look at them as, okay, you actually have a lot of experience and knowledge due to, for example, sensory sensitivities, differences in information processes. Because, for example, screen addiction, for example, the mental health implications of technology, those exhibit differently in those neurodiverse populations. But actually, we see those impacts spread out across the broad population as well, just on a different scale. So should we be looking at, for example, looking at using neurodiverse populations as lead users and really empowering that population rather than exploiting them, which has currently been a substantial issue within our society. And I think that we're going to need to really bring a lot of those big questions and change how we operate in commercial models and change the things that we value substantially in order to make this ethical. Because right now it is, how can we make the most money? And for example, we've seen changes in models recently, AI models, about how we engage with them. Rather than going to them and asking a question and getting an answer back, it will often ask you five questions back. It might give you some information, but then it'll ask you 5 questions back. Why has that changed recently? Because that gets you to spend more tokens, which is literally, I'm going to put more money into the machine. Is that in our best interests? No, because that's getting us to spend more time in those models. And we have seen unhealthy use of those models, more time being spent on them, leading to things like AI-induced psychosis at its most extreme. So, but yet, it's more valuable for those AI models to get users to spend more time on them, although we know it's unhealthy, although we know it's currently not beneficial in its current form. So we need to change a lot of those commercial paradigms, a lot of those drivers, to make sure that people are making correct decisions, are making ethical decisions.
Okay, thanks for that, Kayla. Dex, can we and how can we throw any kind of ethical blanket around this whole thing? Is it impossible, or is it yet possible, and who should do it?
I think it is still possible. Who does it? It will require a whole bunch of leaders from public and private sector and civil society to be making the conversation about the hard ethical choices a mainstream conversation. Right now, a lot of the conversation is in rooms like this with a small number of experts and leaders who are really examining these issues in a detailed way. But a lot of the ethical choices will be things that are profound, won't necessarily have a clear right or wrong answer. They will be choices that societies need to make. And some of these questions, are just so thorny. I would say generally, it will be really important not to frame these debates as mostly technical problems with technical solutions. So one of, I think, the great missteps in a lot of the conversations about AI ethics over the last, 10, 20 years has been literally talking about it as AI ethics. It's not, it's just ethics. It is a conversation about values and morality and what does responsible leadership look like for organizations. There is no clever algorithmic fix for a bunch of these things. These are choices that are down to business leaders and public sector leaders. Perfect example, right? We will absolutely end up in a world in the next decade where you will begin to see huge breakthroughs in medicine using AI that allow us to tackle major diseases. You will see new cures for cancers that have been shaped by AI. They will be wonder drugs. They will be therapies that potentially are life-changing. Will the NHS be able to afford those? Will we be able to actually ensure that access to those drugs is available to our entire population? Or will it be something where a very tiny sliver of the population globally can afford these things which give you years of life and everyone else has to sort of make do? That is a profound ethical problem. And that, of course, then begs a whole bunch of questions about how we resource the health care system to make those advances available to everyone. Other perfect example, the resource consumption of AI we've talked about a bunch. In a world where commoditized AI systems will allow, any company to do amazing things very quickly with these systems, but they're all real resource, usage, concerns. 30 seconds of generative AI video is consuming as much power as running your microwave for an hour. Should you actually be creating apps and offering services that are just generating garbage, when of course that is going to cost our society in some other way? These are choices that companies will have to really think about and create a value system and be transparent about those things.
How do we persuade that single person billionaire company that you mentioned earlier? How do we persuade him or her to embrace this and to observe these ethical standards that we might want to deploy right across the AI sector? How do we persuade that single company to do it?
I think you've got to start just by talking about it in a much louder way. Right now, the conversation with those companies and a bunch of those leaders of those companies is very narrowly scoped around how can I just acquire as much of your product as fast as possible to drive economic growth. And of course, the nature of that growth, and is it placed on a real sustainable foundation? I don't just mean environmentally, but is it built on a strong set of, pillars of societal support? That is going to be absolutely critical, so that this delivers what we want for our societies over the coming years. And right now, that conversation is not mainstream. That is not something that we're hearing from leaders.
Much for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to bring in Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Obviously, we are on, I think, the third week of this AI investigation. I have to be honest, during the course of that, there have been ups and downs in terms of the evidence that we've heard. Huge positives, huge benefits from the AI revolution. But at the same time, as you have heard, there are a lot of worries. And I'm sitting here today thinking about what people at home, the masses of people at home that are watching this committee will be thinking. I'm being quite sarcastic in saying masses, but these things do create worries, because we've heard this morning around about fully automated industries, billion-dollar companies run by one person. We have heard around about all of the changes that can take place because of AI, which may make people redundant. Some would say in more ways than one. What are the positives for those folks who may be sitting at home just now thinking, where do I fit into all of this? Dex, please.
The technology itself should allow us to do unbelievably transformative things for our societies. There's an entire debate about whether access to the technologies that are coming in the next, 10, 15 years could allow us to build a radically different economic model where you have an abundance of resources and you're actually able to bring a whole bunch of new tools to bear on solving some of those massive fundamental challenges that we've talked about. Climate change, inequality, poverty, transformation of public services. If you've got AI that is as good as human intelligence potentially on most cognitive tasks, that could be enormously game-changing. But how you organize it, how you ensure that the rewards and the benefits do accrue to our entire society, not just to a tiny sliver of companies and to a tiny sliver of leaders of those companies, that is something which we don't currently have good answers for. It is not something that is, I would say, a topic of mainstream conversation. And so it's something which I think we're right to be concerned about. The positives, though, are things that really could dramatically change the quality of life for future generations. AI isn't just this one thing on its own. It, of course, turbocharges discoveries and breakthroughs on any number of fronts. If you can cure cancer, if you could enable commercial nuclear fusion power and get clean, unlimited energy, how transformative would that be for our societies and for our entire economic model?
So can I come back to one of your points earlier? Because I think this is one of the important ones. Because I'm going to come back to that one-person billion-dollar company, and we already have on the planet billion-dollar, trillion-dollar companies who are at the forefront of all of this. Some would argue that they're not ethical at this moment because they don't pay the taxes that some of us believe that they should. But you said earlier about curing of cancer and the possibility of new treatments coming into play. And we can already see huge differences in terms of early diagnosis from AI applications. But you said yourself, who is that treatment going to be available to? Is that only going to be available to the elites who run big companies, or is that going to be available to everyone? These are the questions that we need to answer in order to deal with the pessimism around about where this may leave some folk, a lot of folk, out there.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. We don't solve our problems by pretending they don't exist. And there is I think, pretty one-sided framing of the value of this technology from folks who, I think, reasonably, in a well-meaning way, want to champion the potential of the technology. But, of course, there are massive challenges. These are things that speak right to the core of what kind of people and societies do we want to be in a future where the most powerful technology in history is being summoned. And we don't currently have good answers for these things. The future is arriving at a much faster pace than any technological transformation we have seen in history. This is not the Industrial Revolution. This is not the arrival of the internet. This is something much bigger and faster. And we really do need to have that conversation now, because otherwise the technology will decide for us. Our pace at which we adapt to these technologies is too slow. just very frankly, it is absolutely too slow in Europe and in the UK. How many people think we generally manage the arrival of social media well? This is something much more difficult and bigger. And so we do need to move quite quickly. Otherwise, I actually think you will absolutely end up in a model where it is a tiny sliver of the global elite who reap all sorts of rewards. The average person may find their quality of life plateauing or declining, and then you will see the political and societal backlash, which ends up really threatening the system in a bunch of different ways.
Oh.
There we go. Sorry. Something I'm really, really conscious of, and I mentioned this before, but currently the decisions about what is good, what is safe, what is fair in terms of these models, which are being used globally, is in the hands of a very few people. That is a severe concentration of power. And even, was it the head of Anthropic or the head of OpenAI came out literally this week and said that they were incredibly uncomfortable because they did realise that they were the decision makers behind all of these types of ethical decisions, which are having global implications across vast populations. So that's the scenario that Dex has just outlined of we either let the tech go unchallenged, we let it do its thing, we will wind up with severe concentrations of power with very, very few people, and that will be controlled by companies within the global elite, or we regulate. And we need to not be afraid of stepping in and getting things wrong and, you know, slightly over-regulating, slightly under-regulating. Okay, now we find the middle. We really, really need to lean into that, that zone and not be afraid of doing that, and not stall in the fear of getting it wrong, because there are fantastic opportunities here. So, for example, rare diseases. Right now, Dex had mentioned curing cancer. That's definitely possible, but some cancers get a lot more funding than others because they're much more common. Rare cancers get very little funding, and although they might be technically easier to solve, like from a medical perspective, from a treatment perspective, because of the few people who wind up with those cancers, that research isn't being done. Not because that requires millions of pounds, a lot of teams, a lot of equipment. Whereas in this AI era, it might require one person, one very smart person, and an AI model, and that could literally cure that cancer for a rare disease, causing much less time, which would be absolutely amazing. That would be transformational for so many people on a really, really personal level, but also then having those wider societal implications. So I really do think we need to get in and make sure that this is regulated appropriately so we don't wind up with those unreasonable concentrations of power which will have negative impacts, and instead make sure that this is a positive thing for society overall.
Thank you. I think it was yourself earlier that talked of AI-induced chaos. And I'm playing devil's advocate here because we have to, in some regards. And you, again, earlier, held up your smartphone. And there's been discussion from Dex as well around about what have we done there and has that been beneficial. What we have, I think we would maybe all agree is more communication, but is it actually meaningful communication? And in terms of the use of AI, where we can get more done, will that, or how do we ensure that that is meaningful? Let me give you an example, because probably every single one of us around this table are receiving a lot more mass communication which have been AI produced. Now, the temptation is, of course, to respond using AI, which is not my bag, I have to say, at this moment in time. I'm not sure if some of that communication is as meaningful as it should be. And, you know, what we could see is a situation where there is lots and lots more communication, but is it worthwhile? Is it meaningful? Will it make a difference to our society? How do we get around some of these things so that we don't lead to that AI-induced chaos that you talked about, Kayla?
So previously, I think you're referring to, I mentioned AI-induced psychosis. Now that is a phenomenon where people who are engaging with AI for prolonged periods, AI of course hallucinates to a degree. It has decreased recently, but actually depending on what they're doing with the models, it can increase, it can fluctuate. And essentially, I think the real danger with AI is that they are being programmed for engagement because that benefits these companies. It involves spending more tokens, it involves et cetera, et cetera. They profit off of people engaging with it. The problem with engagement with AI, particularly through prolonged periods, is that while engaging with AI, they're generally programmed to kind of keep you happy. I was speaking to some people from Anthropic last night, and they described AI as a very happy and affirmative being, a very happy and affirmative entity. And whenever you let two AI models speak to each other, they tend to escalate into nearly a Buddhist state of everything's amazing and just this series of wonder, which is very interesting to observe, but actually can be really problematic because now we have our smart devices sitting in our pockets, allowing us to access all sorts of information, whether that's correct, whether that's not correct. It's out there and we can get it at any time. People do doom scroll. It has had severe mental health implications. It has had severe implications for democracy, among all sorts of things. The problem with AI is that whenever it's programmed to be affirmative, you can effectively go to it with anything. Any of the wildest, most outlandish beliefs, and it might call you out on them. Some of them have got some safeguards in place where they will call you out for unsafe behaviours. But actually, what we find is the more you engage, the more you're able to work around those safeguards, which means they will affirm, for example, conspiracy theories. They will confirm dangerous and harmful beliefs, and in some situations they will encourage dangerous behaviours, which is a real risk and a serious escalation from what we have on social media, because it is affirming, it is creating a one-person silo, which really can affirm very dangerous beliefs. So there's a serious risk in there of that, and that's again where regulation really needs to come in, and where we really need to dive in. We really need to deepen our understanding of how AI works, because currently we don't know how these models work. We don't understand their logic paths and their thinking. And actually, again, speaking to a lot of these leaders within this industry, there is generally the belief out there that we're going to have a lot of breakthroughs in neuroscience and psychology within the next few years, because we're spending so much time looking at how do these neural networks work, how do these AIs, what are their thought patterns, and how do they reach their decisions, because that's not something we currently know. And they do genuinely believe that we're going to have a lot of breakthroughs in human neuroscience and human psychology, because we're going to spend so much time looking at those models.
We'll wait and see if we have those breakthroughs. Dex, I wonder if you could answer that question as well, and maybe go a little bit further, because we have had the discussion around about the guardrails, around about the safeguards, what we actually need to do there. But as has been discussed, really what's required is that international framework agreement, which I think may well be unlikely or very difficult to reach. How do we persuade those folks at the moment, the elites who are in control, that an international framework is the right thing for all of us and for them to follow too?
Well, I think on the international framework piece, a lot of the things that I'm sure that pretty much everyone in the room would want for a strong, successful future Scottish society, they're the same things that countries all over the world are also really hungry to hold on to as well. You want to have a future where you've got economic growth. You want to have one where you've got strong, resilient societies. I'm sure you want to have one where you've got a well-equipped younger generation with the right skills to navigate the world, that is prepared for the huge range of challenges of the future. You want to protect what it means, to have Scottish culture and values, that, whole set of things which make Scotland special. And these are things where I think there's a conversation that is ripe to be had, with leaders from a lot of other countries, including a lot of smaller countries, which also feel that they don't have a seat at the top table on some of the existing AI governance conversations. So there's obviously been some semblance of international engagement between, the major powers over AI. You've had the AI safety summits that took place, such as at Bletchley Park. There's an upcoming summit being hosted by India. Obviously, those are things which, are established forum. They have, a certain type of value, but there's a whole bunch of other folks who got to have a seat at the table. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Scotland to be doing is looking to drive that intensified collaboration between other countries that are in the same sort of position, who have these kinds of concerns, who might not be at the top rank of those powers in the existing AI governance frameworks, and to say these are all things that we want to see as part of that framework too. And it's a lot of countries. It is absolutely, if you add up all those powers which are in a similar position, it's well more than half the world's population. It is a big open diplomatic opportunity, I would say, right now. And it's one also, I would say, I've been traveling all over the world talking to policymakers and industry leaders and civil society leaders over the last couple of months, and I've been having a number of those conversations, and I think there's a great willingness to look for new models of international engagement entirely on these things. There is no perfected home or framework for talking about a bunch of these things. A lot of the AI Safety Summit was literally focused on the technical safety risks of AI models, and everything we've talked about here today, just that scratching of the surface of the societal challenges of AI, it's vastly more than just safety.
It's desperate for me to finish because we're running out of time. But I just one final question, because we've talked about the Scotlands, the Estonias, the South Koreas of this world, but the drivers of all of this at this moment, the elites, if you like, are mainly American tech companies. America is not a nation that is well renowned for creating good regulation. It could be said that this current regime in the United States, even less so than previous ones. How do we persuade those giants, the elites, that an international framework is the right way forward for them as well?
I mean, this is one where, if you look at the public polling, in the United States, the attitudes that have been shared by a lot of different leaders, including from, public society, there's actually, I think, a great deal of commonality with a number of the things we've talked about today. There is a great deal of concern about the future we are heading for. Absolutely, I think big tech and the current US administration have a particular point of view, and where they want to get to with the AI ecosystem. It is not a view, I would say, that is in fact, I think, very popular with a lot of people. And so there is, I think, a great opportunity. There's a window of time now to really begin to drive this conversation in a much bigger way across different ecosystems. And, we'll see how that can really, begin to shape some of those decision-maker preferences within the tech industry. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, the tech industry does require, society in order to be able to fully function. It is something that, the conversation on these things has yet to become mainstream, so we don't fully know where we can shape this.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much. Look, this has been a really incredible session. I think there's been a lot of very interesting answers. I'm also intrigued as to figure out which time zones you're both in, because the sun has been setting for Dex as it's been rising for Kayla Megan, and that's been interesting to watch as it's been going on. But look, thank you very much. There's some, I think, very interesting questions and things that we will definitely want to follow up on. So thank you very much for your time. I was about to say this morning, but this evening or this morning, whichever is applicable to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And we will suspend for 10 minutes. So we'll back 4:10 past. Well, welcome back. We now have our second panel of witnesses on our short inquiry into artificial intelligence. And I'm very pleased that we are joined by Steve Aitken, the founder of Intelligent Plant Limited, and also Leo Fakrul, CEO of XYNQ and Mamba Sounds. And I have to say, we are, unfortunately do not have Rich Wilson, and I'd just like to sort of note on the record that he had a small accident this morning, and I'm sure the whole committee will join me in wishing him a speedy recovery. We have just over an hour, so I just appreciate if we could have concise questions and if possible, this is an expansive topic, concise responses. And I'd just like to hand straight to my Deputy Convener, Michelle Thompson.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you. I'm going to come to you first, Leo, if that's okay. Now, originally in our papers, we had Ziad, who I think is a partner of yours from Mamba Sounds, but I think you're appearing under a different company name today. And I think it would be useful, first of all, to understand what it is you're doing in the AI space and why, and what's brought you to that point, if you like.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So yes, Ziad was meant to appear today in front of you all. The problem that we're solving today at XYNQ Zinc is the fraud problem within the music industry. So currently there's almost a $3 billion worldwide problem at the first mile within the music industry. And XYNQ is positioned directly to go ahead and solve that problem by using artificial intelligence as well as machine learning to go ahead and find the bad actors before a fraud even happens. The competitors in the space are currently deploying fraud tactics once a fraud has already happened. Where Mamba Sounds has already operated as a record label, as an artist collective, has found data and infrastructure to go ahead and stop the fraud before it even happens through XYNQ, the spin-off company. I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely does make sense. And it'd also be useful because we're following on from a session earlier where we had Kayla Megan Burns in, who's a board member specialising in AI for the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, the RSNO. And I suppose it would be useful to understand its scale, the scale of the problem and the implications for the artistic sector in terms of fraudulent activity around their material. And also, we heard from Dex Hunter-Torrick, who was also in the previous panel, that he could see the possibility where there would be one person operating a company and it'd be $1 billion turnover, such as the, with effective utilisation of AI. So it'd also be useful to understand where, the scale of the problem and where you see yourself operating and why you think potentially the new product that you're looking at could fit in that niche.
Fantastic question. So the scale of the problem, first of all, we need to look at the global music industry and specifically the digital music industry. What we're looking at right now is by 2030, the global music industry for digital music specifically will be worth over $100 billion. And at this current moment in time, there's 10% of fraudulent activity across this whole industry. So where we're looking at by 2030, the problem will arise to $10 billion worldwide. And you're looking at hotspots such as Indonesia, Brazil, South America overall, and parts of Southeast Asia that are being the problematic high ground areas for fraud or fraudulent activity. But what do I mean by music fraud in the first place? This is where I'm talking about metadata spoofing. So somebody comes in, an artist or a bad actor comes in and is giving out the bad information in which is not actually official. It's not authentic. They're using fake IDs as well to be able to upload music under a different alias. So, for example, we could look at the likes of Jay-Z, artificial music generated with Jay-Z's voice for a fake song that never actually happened. That intellectual property should belong to Jay-Z himself because it's his voice, but the AI has went ahead and made the music and uploaded it and is able to make money from this song. Now, that's one aim of the fraudster itself is to go ahead and money launder, right? And when we look at the amount of songs that are coming in through every day, we're looking at 120,000 songs being uploaded through distributors onto digital streaming platforms such as Spotify and Apple Music, as well as YouTube Music, every single day. That number is looking to rise up to 200,000 every single day by 2030 as well. Now, the scale of a problem is magnificent because no one has the time, no distributor company has the time to go ahead and look through 200,000 songs per day, in which if you are using AI to go ahead and commit fraud, we can also use AI to retaliate the fraud as well. We can use machine learning to find the anomalies within behavioral data, within the metadata, as well as network economics, to be able to understand where the fraudsters are coming from and put a stop at the source. Where X, Y, and Q is specifically designed to go ahead and stop the problem, we have a specialty within the music industry. We've been operating as an artist, as a label, as a distributor for the last 3.5 years, as this company, Mamba Sounds, goes. The spin-off has given us the direct tools through TechScaler, through the Data Lab, as well as other Scottish organisations to be able to position ourselves in the global market for industry fraud within the music industry.
Thank you. And I'd like to open it out to both of you, because obviously, Steve, you've got a very established company. I'd like to just sort of finish off this round by exploring what you see are the critical factors around skills and ecosystem that has enabled you to operate as you do, and critically could enable Scotland to compete globally in those, you know, in these areas, because we can't compete in certain things at scale if we think other industries, but this is an area where we can compete. So perhaps you could come in and answer that first, Steve. Obviously, you know, I've looked at your background. I know what your background is.
Thanks, yes. In terms of skills and ecosystem and how that's meant that we've been able to have a company that's lasted for just about 20 years now in computing science. I went to university in Aberdeen, went and did computing science in the end, went to do philosophy to begin with, but changed to computing science because I figured it would get me a job. There's a slight irony with what's going on just now when you think about it. But without that ecosystem, without that knowledge to get you on the first step of work, you really do struggle to get started. Going from that to an employer and working there for what felt like a lifetime, but turns out it was only 4 years before I set up the company, you know, you get a lot from that. You get the exposure to the economy, to what companies do, how they run, and how they operate and keep themselves going, which is really important. It's something that's really close to my heart, actually. We do a thing called the Inform Prize that's about getting students in front of companies as early as possible and getting the projects that they're doing in front of them so that they can actually see this. And we're going to be bringing that to the rest of Scotland next year. So it was Aberdeen and Glasgow this year. Edinburgh are well up for it. And we've got Stirling and a number of... we've gone for every university that does computing science. So the ecosystem. I think really Scotland is really good at people coming together and being able to do things together. And when I say people, I mean people and companies. The only way you can do that is with something that's actually a key thing to what this committee is discussing just now, and that's trust. Trust is at the root of all the ethics. Why do you have ethics? Because without ethics, you can't have trust. And really, we are really good at building trust with people. I think Scottish people are really good at it because we can be really straight talking. We tend not to over-egg things. And it's really good for building trust. That has meant that I'm surrounded by a number of people, a number of companies that honestly I believe are out for our all best interest, all of our best interest. And I would say the skills to be able to do that are things that I've learned rather than things that have been taught. So ethics and how to behave correctly are becoming very important in this field. And bringing that to the right levels, I think, is something that would make a big difference. I remember I was in front of a business school lecture, and a student put his hand up and said, "Hey, if I have the choice between doing the right thing and making no money, or doing the wrong thing and making a lot of money for the company, what should I do? And I said, well, if you do the wrong thing, you might make a lot of money today, but you'll make nothing in the future. And there was a lot of surprise in the room to that comment to a business school class. And I think I'd like to bring that surprise a lot earlier in people's learning so that they get that really, really grounded in their character.
That's a really, really important point you make. I know myself, before I was elected, I'd done some primary research into the perception of Scotland's global diaspora, and it was about 1,200 participants across 72 different countries, and one of the big thematics that came out was the trust factors in Scotland as a place to do business and people to do business with. So that's something we can trade on, because it's a currency that has high value in today's world. But returning to my point, Leo, obviously you're younger. I think we all hope that you'll have a great career and future ahead of you. But so what is it you've seen in terms of the skills you've been able to learn and the ecosystem that you've been supported by that gives you confidence that Scotland can compete globally in this space?
Fantastic. I think when we discuss the ground of where myself and my co-founder have began, it was actually at school from the beginning, where we had the opportunity to do the national fives, to the hires, to the advanced hires, and then make our way to either college or university. Myself, I went to college before I went to university. My background's in economics and finance. I done an undergraduate for free without any student debt. And now I can go back to university as well through the Data Lab scholarship incentive and study artificial intelligence and data science, which is a huge boost for not only my skill set, but also for the company as well. That foundation is not found everywhere. I'm super grateful for everything that Scotland's been able to do for myself and my family, but also the idea that we can come here and we can build something so great and compete at a larger scale against multinationals from Canada, from the US, from all around the world, and have a massive say in the matter. And I think when we look at what we just spoke out over there with Steve, which was trust, it's huge. Myself and my co-founder, we've built in the last 3.5 years deep industry trust with the distributors, our clientele going forward. And that's how we already have an organic pipeline ready to go as soon as a product is ready. We already have letters of interest at hand to be able to make this a real product with a unique value point. This is one of the things that keeps us in front of our competitors. And I would say it and urge to a lot of the youngsters across Scotland as well, use the infrastructure that we have in front of us, the ecosystem that is in front of us. Go to university and grab a degree in engineering, medicine, or economics, or whatever, law, even if you want to study. But use that degree in any way, shape or form where you can in the future and try and use it for the good. For us, it's been massively helpful. My co-founder is computing science background, and so he's been working directly in London, but I wish he was able to work somewhere in Scotland and could compete directly with the London competitors down the road. I think it's a massive testament to what this country has been able to do with the amount of companies such as Skyscanner who have come out of the ground, and I want us at Zinc to be able to be one of those companies alongside Skyscanner as well.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
I'd like to bring in Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. I wanted to ask you about governance and regulation. Leo, you highlighted that it blew me away, 120,000 fraudulent music releases every single day. So what's the role of government in this? I mean, given that it's across not only countries but continents that this is happening, what should be the role of government to help stop this fraud that you're talking about?
I'd just like to make a point. So it's 120,000 songs that are uploaded every single day, and around 10% of those are fraudulent at this current moment in time. Right. But with the current rate, we're probably looking at 20,000 songs becoming fraudulent every single day of being uploaded. The role of governance is going to be massive. What we're looking at right now is the digital streaming acts across Europe as well as the US, and they're coming into hand quite massively. What we're looking at right now, especially for the product that we're building, is based around those rules and regulations. When the DSA Act comes in, what we're expecting is for all the companies across Spotify and all the DSPs, digital streaming platforms, to go ahead and use those regulations directly, to go ahead and stop fraud at the first mile, in which Zinc comes in with a product red flag. That's where we come in and we say that's our strong point, that's our USP. So in terms of what the role of governance has, it's massive. And I think, I was reading about Singapore and how they go ahead and play with AI in their ecosystem. And they're not building the next ChatGPT, but they're building the regulations around the next ChatGPT. They're going ahead and putting limits on what is actually possible with the likes of these superpowers that we can work with today, but also looking at it from a point of view where if you have trust, security and safety within this ecosystem, we will be one of the leaders within the system as well, just not directly ChatGPT or OpenAI. We'll have a whole different angle at it, but it is required to go ahead and build that system. You look at the financial sector, banking, wherever you are, fraud is a massive concept there as well. And we do have, in Scotland as well, we do have infrastructure there to go ahead and improve safety within those markets. I would love to see this for artificial intelligence and machine learning as well.
Okay. The general public themselves have a lot of concerns about AI in terms of privacy of data, data harvesting. We're talking about bias, we're talking about misinformation and so on. Is there any legislation that is currently in place that is tackling that anywhere in the world and that we can learn from if we're going to bring legislation through in Scotland?
I think we have to go back to Singapore. I think they have a really good tactic just now in how they protect their residents and their citizens as well. And directly I can look at it in terms of data privacy. The World Wide Web is a whole different world, isn't it? It connects everybody a lot quicker and faster. And so for us, I think we need to look at positioning Scotland with a voice in which we can tackle this directly and have an influence at the table when it comes to these kind of conversations. Steve, I'd love to know your thoughts about this.
So I'm in the place where I currently have a thing going against a company with GDPR. And what I think key with any legislation is that it's actually able to be enforced. Because it's far too easy to have something that's quite wide, but it doesn't actually have any teeth. And I'm wondering which way it's going to go. So I'm in the situation that...
What should the focus be?
I think it should be on what you can actually do. So if you're going to put in place regulations, it should be something that you can verify and something that you can prevent or make happen. An example in this space would be with AI and LLMs. There's what's called a system prompt, which is the bit in the background that is given to the AI before you use it, that tells it how to behave, what to highlight, what to hide. Often this will say, be ethical, do these things in the right way, that sort of thing. But not everybody publishes the system prompt that is actually being used, that is tilting everything that's being responded to. In my mind, that should be published.
I think I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. I'd like to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Leo, Steve. I wonder if maybe I could start with Leo. I think we're always going to need zinc. We're always going to need to retaliate against the bad faith actors by the sounds of it, Leo, because we were talking earlier about the whole ethical approach to this and should it be embedded, is it possible to do so? And I'll come to Steve in a moment to ask more about that, but without giving any of your own secrets away, can we successfully do what you're setting out to do? Will we be able to prevent it today, but it will reappear in another form tomorrow? And will it be an endless journey for companies like yours to try to retaliate against fraud? And is that what we're going to be seeing from now on and into the future, do you think? This constant fight between good faith actors and bad faith actors, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a legacy problem. I think we've had that since the dawn of time, in whichever industry. What I see for myself and the company, for us, I see at this moment in time, artificial intelligence is making music that's passing the Turing test with flying colours. And if you're aware of a Turing test, that's how how well the AI is able to go ahead and pass human behaviour. I believe that's the correct way to go ahead, simple way to put it. And so it's passing with flying colours. And so that means AI music sounds just as human music, right? Which is a huge problem. So how do you detect what AI music actually is? That's the question. For us, that looks at how we evolve a product as time goes by. And evolving the product itself is directly focused on a few things, such as the metadata, but also the network in which you are uploading the music. And now for us, without giving too much away, we want to go ahead and input a KYC system, a Know Your Customer, but we want to call it the Know Your Artist system, where we go ahead and identify each and every single person who's uploading their music and then see who they're connected to with the network economic effect. What we're looking at is, on Spotify, you can see who you have collaborators with. So if I made a song today with Steve, I would put Steve as a collaborator as a feature. But if I went ahead and committed some level of streaming fraud, whether that's inflating my numbers by paying for them or such behaviour, Steve would also be impacted and receive a negative score on his profile. So where Red Flag at Zinc comes in is we look at what did Steve upload in the last few months, what's his pattern of behaviour, what devices is he actually uploading from, and where is the music actually coming from? Is it his voice that we're recognizing each and every time, or is it a voice that the AI has just generated and we're listening to a bunch of slush, we call it AI slush. So that's where we want to come in, and we want to see the product evolve over the period of the new features that the new AIs will go ahead and bring out towards us. But it gives us a really good, strong seat to go ahead and tackle the problem. But the data is a massive, massive issue. We need to get our hands on the data first and foremost, and we don't have enough distributors in Scotland directly, which is why Mamba Sounds, when we first initiated Mamba Sounds, we focus on a worldwide approach. We focus on music in Africa to then be supported in the US, UK, Germany, France, Holland, Canada. Those are our top 7 markets right there. But we took the music from Africa, the distributors working directly within the continent of Africa, and taken them all the way to a global market within the West. And I think that gives us the advantage. That's the reason why we win against everybody else, because we have direct access to the global distributors before anybody else does. I hope that answers the question.
It really does. What's the public's attitude to this slush, though? If it's cheaper, do they care?
I think from a consumer's perspective, I sit on both seats as somebody who, all 3 seats actually, somebody who listens to music on a regular basis. We get submissions, we get at least 10, 20 submissions a day worldwide for Mamba Sounds. We're also looking at, for other seats, which is, we're sitting in the fraud and regulatory seat, but also the consumer aspect. There is a place for AI music. It's just not worth paying for. That's the difference. Because when you go onto YouTube, you could look up a song by Frank Sinatra, a style of Frank Sinatra, but maybe a different version, a rap version, right? And there is a time and space for that, but just not on the market at Spotify, where you have to go ahead and pay to listen. That should be on a different market, and it should be. A lot of DSPs are now looking at completely banning AI music overall. But the question was, at the beginning you said, how do we differentiate the two? Because the Turing test, as I said before, it passes with flying colours. So you want to ban the AI music, but you don't know how the AI music it sounds in the first place. And I think for Scotland overall, for us overall, we're looking at, for Zinc as well, we're looking at methods in harnessing a fair play ground, in which we say, right, the fraud music can, not for fraudulent music, but the AI music can come through, but it's not for the payment, the payer, the subscriber every month. And if you do, I think that will be a whole different market in itself. There will be a similar stance to Spotify, maybe something called AImusic.com that will come along. This is, again, completely fictitious. This could be something that comes along and says, you can listen to AI music or you can generate your own AI music. I'll give you a real reference point right now. There's a company called Sumo.ai. And what they're doing is you can type in a prompt to be able to develop your own song, and you can harness your own beats using AI by giving it styles, etc. I know many big producers around the world right now who are using that same product, but taking the stems from that product and then going ahead rearranging it to a sound that they enjoy. Now, is that artificial intelligence music or is it their music? That's a debate to be had in another time.
From a creativity, Good argument.
Well, people say auto-tune when it first came out in the 90s, or you want to talk about anything else. When auto-tune came around, people said it's going to ruin music completely. But we found artists such as Kanye West who have been able to use auto-tune in such a way. T-Pain, I'm thinking about R&B music specifically, hip-hop music. But they were able to use the auto-tune in a way that was actually quite artistically sound, right? And what we're looking at now is AI music is also coming through the ranks, but how artists actually and producers use them directly is in its own way. What I'm very against is the AI to be able to make the full song, upload the full song, and then going ahead and receiving royalties from it. Because the major problem that I see for artists, these people on Spotify have recorded an average, by the way, in this last year, $12 of income per month. The average artist is getting on Spotify. Now, if you go ahead and make that pool of income challenged with AI, you're looking at that pool per person become very limited. And we've seen cases now in the last year, we've had one AI account which was able to make $10 million from uploading AI jazz music. $10 million. Now, think about how much money was taken away from your average artist just from that one account. And the people who are actually making jazz music. I know a lot of orchestras across Scotland who are making music. They're perhaps not uploading it onto Spotify, but if they did, they'd get a lot of welcome support. However, they're competing against the AIs now, who are able to just go ahead and artificially make a song within seconds, upload it, and be able to money launder frantically. It is stupendous, the amount of money that they're able to make just from going ahead and uploading a few seconds of work. And I think it goes ahead and it underwrites a lot of the artistic values that we hold, especially in the creative sector such as Scotland. It's a massive problem that we see here because we are a country that is, so proud of what we can achieve and what we do. We have the likes of Lewis Capaldi, Calvin Harris, the guys who are, at the top of the game just now. But if we were to see AI music come from there, and would we be happy with it? What do we count as AI music now? So that's the question from my end to you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Leo. Turning to you, Steve, on the wider issue about the ethical battle. Can we win it? Should there be a kind of ethical blanket thrown over the whole AI revolution? Is it possible to do it? Is it always going to be a fight that Leo describes there? Can we win that battle, and should we try to win that battle?
I think ethics is always a fight between what's right and what's easy, and that will always be a thing. I think the key thing is people in this, and not the technology. So when we think about the ethics, it's making sure that people are doing the right thing with AI. If you consider it to be the massive multiplier, that's probably where it is. And if people are doing the right thing, then they'll be doing it better with AI. And if they're doing the wrong thing, unfortunately, they'll also be doing that better with AI. So really, I think we need to focus on people and make sure that when people are doing the wrong thing, we take them to account. And when they're doing the right thing, we reward them.
Which is into the area that Gordon was leading us on about regulation and control and standards and having all of that. Is it too late to try and establish that stuff?
In some way, that will already be established in law, and the way that we deal with directors of companies. It's about understanding where the power lies and who it is that's able to make the most use of it, and making sure that those checks and balances are in place. I personally think that there could perhaps be more in that space, but that would be applicable with or without AI. It's just that the risk and opportunity are both higher with it. So it might make us focus a bit more on making sure that people who run companies run them ethically.
You might have heard Dex in the session just before telling us about the advent of the single-person corporate billion-dollar company, a single person being in control of that. How do we persuade such a person to embrace an ethical framework and ethical standards? Is it a journey we just have to keep working on and fighting to achieve? Is it?
So the single person most people would think about in that context would be Elon Musk. And if you look at his rise, most of it was through at least a facade of ethics. He looked like he was doing the right thing, and he said he was going to do the right thing. And because of that, he got a lot of backing. I would say that since he has had a slightly different view, or I have a sticker on my car that says I bought this before he went nuts, because people buy things from people that they like, that they trust, and when that's broken, they don't, and then it falls down. If someone wants to build $1 billion company and then they're done, great, but what are you going to do next? We need to make sure that people can see beyond. This is actually another thing that's close to my heart. So I was the first company I worked for those 4 years. There were 2 directors, and they sold the company. And this is a few years later. And afterwards, there's a big existential question of what am I here for? What am I supposed to do? I've got all this money, but what am I going to do with it? And did I prefer to have the company that I had than the money? I think bringing these realizations back to people at an early age so that they can see that building a company is not just about earning a lot of money. It's actually about doing a good thing, because when it comes to the end of your life, everybody cares about how they're viewed and whether or not they're seen to have been a good person, and there's no amount of money can buy that.
Trust is at the heart of this. It's trust our saviour then. Is trust going to save us from a horrible future that will be endlessly fighting against bad faith actors? If we can establish that within any of these frameworks, do we have a chance, Leo?
Yeah, I think when we first came up with a concept of the fraud problem itself, it was because we were defrauded in the first place. Somebody had went ahead and put Mamba Sounds as an artist collaborator on a song that we did not make or sign off on. Then they were able to we were hurt financially, reputationally, as well as operationally. It impacted what kind of music, what music we were putting out later on, right? But going back to your question, the reason that we do these things, the reason that we make these companies is ultimately to answer a problem, to go ahead and solve a problem. And I think most entrepreneurs, especially around the people that I hang around with and spend time with, we're looking to solve a problem and make lives easier. I mean, there's one thing that a good friend of mine who owns a company called Scrub Marine, a maritime technology company, he says, we're looking to go ahead and give the painkiller, not a multivitamin. Right, so it's meant to go ahead and stop the pain for the industry, and not just be a feature of for a product, not just a feature that you can go ahead and feel okay with through a multivitamin. And when we speak about these kind of solutions, we're all using AI somehow, some way in our day-to-day or our solutions as well. And it again comes down to what is the problem that you're solving and why are you solving it. I think that's one of the bigger asks for a lot of entrepreneurs and people who are able to raise funding, is when you're sitting in front of an investor committee and holding those relations, and they're asking you a few questions. Why are you in the first place building this? What is the problem that you're solving, and how are you solving it, and so on. You want to have some level of resonating feeling with the problem itself. So when we go ahead and solve a problem, we're solving it from a place of hurt. We're solving it from a place where we don't want this to happen again. Imagine if we had a red flag system that went ahead and stopped the fraud before it even happened. We would be safe. So I think for myself and a lot of entrepreneurs who are solving big problems within Scotland just now and the UK overall, I think for us is to look at how are we going ahead and impacting society? How are we really looking at, and I had a problem with it actually at the beginning. In the last few weeks, I was asking myself, who's it actually benefiting? Is it the distributors? Is it the big labels? Is it the Warners, the Universal Musics? But I've thought about it, and even the guys who are helping right now, the independent artists, they get to go ahead and they have a level of satisfaction for products as well. So we started interviewing a few, artists and so on, and we said, if we were to be able to give you a verification, a pass, an integrity badge, and give you a license that says your song is fraud-free, and then you take it to Spotify, etc. And let's say they went ahead and they gave you, they had false allegations against you. Well, you could go ahead and use that in the system of the law, in the court system. And you could use that verification system because our data would be 0.001% false positive rate. We want it to be at that high level so we can say, right, this person is fully fraud-free and their song is hyper-focused on making sure that it is real artistic creative content. And I think that belief from our end that we can help the small independent artists as well, going back to helping them again, it it sparked something within me as well to say, right, we're doing the right thing here, because we are helping the smallers, the ants in the system who help build the foundation, as well as, you know, the big players, the lions, the kings of the jungle, essentially, because everyone can benefit from this. And I think when you are solving a problem, you have to look at who is benefiting, who are you actually aiding, who are you stopping the pain for. And I think for us, it's industry-wide. It's on that vertical. Artists, distributors, labels, and DSPs as well, such as Spotify and so on.
Okay, absolutely fascinating, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. Convener.
Right, I think Michelle Thompson would like to follow up with
it's just following up a point you've made, Steve. The kind of ethics has been a golden thread, if you like, through the 3 sessions we've had. We've had the need for that emphasised from a variety of witnesses. But if we kind of forecast forward, potentially AI such a significant disruptor to our society, that people generally, I think, you know, for many people having more leisure time is a curse as well as an opportunity. And your point therefore about ethics, does it actually mean from a skills perspective we should be teaching ethics in schools, because humanity, and I appreciate this is quite a big question, is going to have to encounter this kind of existential crisis, arguably triggered by significant momentum in AI? And I mean, we're in this committee, we're not going to solve any of this, but should we be thinking just practically about teaching more ethics in schools to counter some of this?
You're saying exactly the sort of stuff I'm thinking. When that existential question that the director of the company that sold it had is something that's coming to us all. When you look at what's happening, the end result, loads of leisure time, that dream of being able to have a coffee with the sea in front of you, and then you go, why am I here? What am I doing? You know, the arts have taken a backseat to science in a big way in the last 10 years. But you can see a resurgence in the arts to be able to bring that to people. And I do think at an early age would make a big difference. I think it's not arts or science on their own, but it's how they combine and the way that you go, here's how you can do the right thing. And this is where you'll gain, and this is how other people will gain, and this is how we'll all live. I do think we need to get that at a very early age, and it might come down to even how we advise parents and at that stage, because there are some grounding concepts that are really early in a child's life. But you know, ultimately, we need to. There's a thing around how we make sure that people are able to live. And it's easy to look at the big questions around energy and the cost of heating and things like that. These things have been right at the forefront of our minds recently for most people. But when it comes to that and people have struggled, they lose sight of the longer term. The only thing that you care about is your survival, and you will make decisions that you potentially regret later on. I think we need to make people or help people see the long term so that they can make the right decisions all the time. I think we've got a lot of people in the arts in universities that think AI is going to replace them. I was chatting to some of them at Aberdeen University and saying, I think the complete opposite. I think this makes a massive demand for the arts, especially since I started off doing philosophy and went to computing. I just see it going back the other way. So yes, I strongly encourage bringing that earlier. Not replacing STEM. STEM has been one of those, we need to get more STEM in younger, yes, but maybe add arts and that level of thinking that's required to it, so that it's not without a purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to bring in Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, Convener. Maybe a computing science with philosophy degree is the way forward for all of this. Thanks for coming today. And Convener, I should say that I've met with Steve previously for some really good conversation. I'd like to stick with the ethics aspect first of all, because we've heard from others today around about who is doing well. Leo, you mentioned the fact that Singapore is driving things forward, but with limits. But we're operating in a global context here, and what we really require in terms of governance is some kind of international framework, which may not be seen as beneficial to some of the elites out there at this moment. Do you think that that international framework is required in order for us to have the right governance here and to continue the trust that there obviously is in Scotland's businesses? Leo, do you want to maybe go first, please?
So, thank you for the question, Kevin. When I think of this atmosphere of artificial intelligence, it's first of all rapid. It is fast. And so any regulations and laws that you want to put in, you have to move very quickly, otherwise you will be at the backhand. Secondly, we cannot go ahead and tell other countries what to do. You know, it's hard for us to go ahead and really make sure that what we believe in, they also believe in, because they might sit from a different standpoint. However, we can make sure that those regulations are within Scotland itself. If we can do this effectively, I believe that we could have a playing ground, a sandbox, if you will, for a lot of the high-growth companies to come to Scotland and build their companies here in an ethical but also limiting way. And I think these are the voices that you want to have who can help shape the regulations around worldwide. If you can bring more companies here, if you are able to go ahead and put the policies in place to bring the leaders in the space to build in Scotland, then you will soon realise that Scotland has a massive voice at the table, a huge voice at the table. Where we're talking about one individual could run $1 billion company. How do you bring that person to operate from Scotland, in Scotland? And I think harvesting that framework, that network as well, is really important to say that we have the facilities to be able to build this. And I think it's an infrastructure thing that we can do from here on out. If we're able to build the data sets, the data rooms, etc., that we need from Scotland, it gives us a massive advantage worldwide. We can attract more talent to Scotland and build from within. And I think when you build from within, you will have a taller tower compared to your competitors.
Thank you. Steve, please.
I was just going through in my head there the way that this tends to work with investors and founders, and how much control a founder really has when there's an investor. The ethics of investors is something I've not seen a lot of thought in. And I've seen founders who are full of ethics pulled in directions they don't want to be pulled in by investors. So I don't know what the answer to that is. In terms of the global question and do we need it, it would be really helpful if we had it. It would be really helpful if we had it. I worry that it might not come in time to be able to have the effect we need. And that actually the global thing is kind of the stick, and the carrot would be easier and can be done a lot quicker, and it can be done locally. And by doing the carrot of helping people realise how ethics work, helping them set up companies that embody trust, that will thrive in an environment where people will choose them, means that perhaps we're the country that will have the $1 billion single-person company that then decides that they want to make the rest of the country a good thing.
So that kind of carrot situation, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, are you saying that, you know, some of the decisions that the likes of Scottish Enterprise or the Scottish National Investment Bank make in terms of helping out new players in the game, that there should be an ethical basis built in before that investment comes into play? Is that what you're suggesting?
That would be brilliant. I think at the moment a lot of those decisions are made in the same way that an investor would make decisions, and they're based around concern of whether money is going to create more money as opposed to whether money is going in the right direction. That's my opinion. But I think it's because we set the rules that way and people follow them. We say to them, this is public money, treat it like your own, we don't want you to waste it. So people do their best to say, right, how do we make sure that we keep this? And tend to look, in my view, at the short term of, so if we invest this, do we get this back in the next 2 or 3 years? How does that work? That's a common thing. It's not particular to any organisation, I would say. And really only by explaining example stories and can we change those opinions. But adding that as a thing to think about and making the instruction to those organisations could have a massive impact. Being able to say that we are looking to encourage things that are doing the right thing, that are helping others, that are things that the country would be proud of, I think would have a massive positive economic benefit.
Would you agree with that, Leo?
100%. That was very well put together. I think, and how you went ahead, Kevin, to say that we need the Scottish National Investment Bank to go ahead and make those decisions as well from the top down. I think that's a really good strategy as well. What kind of investors are we seeing? What kind of angel investors are we seeing from Scotland? Where are they coming in from? And how are they holding themselves in respecting themselves in this industry? I think that's where it begins. And if you have really good relations with investors, prior to Steve's answer, I was going to say, well, find investors who are going to be on the same wavelength as you. But that's not always possible to find investors who are on the same wavelength, want to make money, and be able to have a right ethics. It's almost an impossible, it's almost impossible. But a lot of founders that I know in Scotland, specifically through Royal Bank of Scotland Accelerator, as well as TechScaler, as well as we were also part of Heriot Watt's Edinburgh Business School incubator as well. We know many founders across the board, and they're always looking for investors, but we're always looking towards the US because the ticket sizes are huge. We can look at the US and they're coming in with huge checks for us, but it might make us question what our ethics actually are and how strongly do we believe in them. So I believe if we were to have, Zinc would go ahead and benefit massively if the Scottish National Investment Bank was to look at us and say, well, the problem you are solving is huge, and we can back you and we can give you the right infrastructure and the right nest to build it in. But we want you to stay here. That's a fantastic offer. I would never say no to. You'd have to look at that and think that is what's going to keep us here, and at the same time help us develop something bigger and in a much more strategic way as well. And I think that's what we need more than anything. We need to have that strategy from within.
Are there any other carrots that you think that are required to ensure that business that's being carried out here is ethical?
So education, and we spoke about education for young people. I think there might be the same thing in education for people that are starting up businesses, and people that are investing in businesses. If we do research into how does it actually play out when you act in different ways, and what is the outcome, to give definitive answers so that people can scientifically say this is the right thing to do, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's actually good for us. I think a lot of it is education, and I think that's true also of the use of AI and some of the other dangers around it. A challenge with that is that the education for that is changing rapidly. Like what we would tell someone this year has probably moved on from what we would tell them last year in terms of what to look out for when you're using AI, things to think about and things to worry about. But we need a very dynamic way to keep closing the loop of information with people that have knowledge in this space back to everyone in the public. I think the thing is that everyone in the public has access to like ChatGPT and Gemini. And I worry about when I type things in. I'll give you an example. I needed to get 3 quotes to be able to do a purchase, right? So it's actually very similar to some of the processes in the Scottish Government. And so I thought, I'm going to get AI help with this. Hey, where can I get 3 quotes for this type of computer from? And it came back and said, I found these 3 places you could get it from. Do you want me to generate the quotes? Right. Now, me knowing how that works, I know that when that generated the quotes, that wouldn't have been generated by the company. It would have been generated from nothing. But Joe Public would accidentally be committing fraud. They would go, yes, please. Great, I've got these quotes. They've got the logos of companies on them. They have all the right numbers, and go ahead and use it. I think these are the things that we really need to close the loop on education with the right stories that people know that when they get something, what it means and what's behind it and what it's capable of and what it's not capable of.
Have you got anything to add to that, Leo?
I think you talk about the carrots and what's going to be a really good incentive for us, even at Zinc, to remain ethical and so on. I think it's, for us, I would look at it in terms of what benefits are there, to staying at that ethical level. How can we go ahead and remain, understanding of our own decisions, and how can we say, for myself, it's by developing an advisory board that is not only complementary but full of diverse voices and so on, to help me make the best decision as CEO of a company, and that gives us a really good ground game, if you will, against the other companies that we're competing against. If you look at the carrot again, we need to talk about, yes, education is already on the table. I mean, the Data Lab is offering scholarships to universities and partnering with universities to give them access to the resources that they need to have that high-level certification. But it would even also look at how can we get talent who have access to, this network. How can we get them into these cycles, these jobs? How can we go ahead? I mean, we spoke about a $1 billion company, one man, $1 billion company. Who wants that? Realistically, who actually wants that? People thrive and network with people. We're nothing without one another. And I think that community is a massive thing. And people work for the sole purpose to be next to people, I think. It's one of the things that we actually require. So I think, how can we get the workforce in Scotland to work with each other, and how can we trade within each other as well? How can we support each other even more? And those are the benefits that I'm looking at for Zinc. How can we go ahead and offset some of our responsibilities that we have to other Scottish companies? That would be massive. I think that would help us with tax rates as well in there. To be reduced a little bit. VAT could be reduced a little bit in there. But those are the things that we're looking at. If we can build it and develop it in-house in Scotland, can we get it for cheaper compared to making it in India or even Turkey?
So one of the things that you brought up there, Steve, is procurement and government procurement. That's maybe another carrot, if we could look at government and public sector procurement when it comes to AI and build in that ethical standards there. Would that be beneficial?
I think so. I think also a lot of that's going to change going forward, because the way that procurement is done tends to rely on people generating documents that they're not going to be doing themselves anymore. And when you create the criteria and put it out to a number of people that have access to this, you can go, here's the criteria, generate me the document. Now we've kind of killed the market for the people that were the consultants on how to create a bid. And I do feel like that wasn't work that was well placed anyway. But it means that hopefully, so the good side of it is, it means it's a level playing field. Everybody is able to put in and get out exactly what they are doing, where in a lot of places, people would be doing amazing things and would be so lost in the detail, they'd struggle to get the right point into a bid. So there's a good side to this in terms of everyone will be able to generate incredibly good bid documents. I imagine on the other side, it will probably be something like that that's doing the analysis in the first place too. And then it will come down to a human to make the decision. One of the things that runs through my head quite a lot is that usually the point that we have a human in the loop is actually legally required. So computers don't actually make decisions. People have to, because then there's someone who is legally responsible for the decision. If a computer makes a decision, you can't put it in jail.
I'm going to stick with trust, but change tack a little bit, convener. And obviously, there are huge opportunities for AI. A lot of that opportunity hasn't been grasped yet. A lot of folk don't trust AI completely. And I'm going to use an example that that you gave, Steve, without breaking any commercial confidentiality. But in our discussions, you talked about finding an AI solution for a company, but the company still stuck with the original project that they had in place because there was that edginess around about the entire scenario. How do we ensure that we get the trust across the piece to make sure that we get the very best out of these new technologies?
That's a really good question, and something I wish I had known at the time that I was talking to that company. It was a few years ago, and this was a much earlier stage in AI. It was in neural networks. And to give thanks for the example, it took me a while to click which one you were talking about. But in that case, we were showing engineers a way that they could get more out of an asset. It was an oil and gas asset. A lot of our client base is in oil and gas, and hopefully transitioning. But it showed them they could get a lot more out of the asset that they had. And the engineers actually reacted by trying to follow the worst advice it gave. It was really quite interesting to watch the behaviour, because they wanted to push the system out because they were worried about what it would do to their jobs. This is the natural human reaction that will actually be echoed throughout the country right now. Now, that is not the right decision, because in that moment, when someone makes that decision, they're limiting themselves by not doing it. When it comes to individually and on a small scale, if an individual or a company doesn't adopt AI, they are behind everyone that has. And that means that small companies, individuals, big companies don't have a choice. It's do this or don't survive. In the long term, we have the big question of, so when we follow that path that we must do in the short term, where do we end up? And I think it leaves us with a big question as to how we make sure we're going to catch everyone at the other end. Thinking about that now is the right time, because we do probably have 4 or 5 years to think about that. It might be around a term in Parliament to think about. But it's that sort of time period. It's really short. And we need to think about the other end.
So it's, again, ethics in terms of what do we do as politicians, as leaders, to fully utilise the technology, but also to find other jobs for folks whose jobs may be superseded by the technology. And we heard earlier, we could end up with fully automated industries. So we've got decision-making around about what meaningful work do we find for folk that are currently in those industries that are fully automated.
In the finding work, it's about giving people value, making them feel valued so that they know that they're providing a contribution of worth. At the moment, that's mostly done through work. Before the Industrial Revolution, work would have been lifting and moving, and we couldn't conceive that someone would be sat in front of a display on a computer hitting keys and that would be work, because it would look very easy. So that we don't yet know what the next type of work will be. Ethics comes into mind because it's something that is very hard for a computer to do. But we don't actually know what it is. And we need to focus on that and figure out what it is that people will be doing to better themselves and others going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I may just ask a couple of brief... I'm not sure they are brief, actually, so just questions following on from that. I'm sort of quite interested. I mean, I think this morning we've ended up sort of hyper focusing on kind of single person billion-dollar companies, and they will probably exist, but actually there's probably going to be something that looks a little less dramatic, that's more pervasive. And I wonder, listening to both the previous session and this, if the point is that we need to focus on ensuring that our people are, create rather than just consume, that they produce rather than just process. And do you think that, because it's very difficult to predict precisely, but I'm just wondering, Steve, just following on what you've just said there, are these maybe some of the shifts that we need to think about in order so that we're leveraging AI rather, because if we're just consuming and just processing, AI can do that much better, or we're not really going to be part of the value chain if we're just consuming. Is that the right way of thinking about it? Is that do you think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw from some of the things we're talking about this morning?
I think it's not only a conclusion, but it's why AI companies are getting a lot of investment. Because actually, a lot of what people are putting in questions is really well thought, a bit like the questions here. You can see genius in what they're doing, and then you realise something you didn't before. At the moment, most AI models have been trained on all of the data that you can see on the internet, the lot. And they have no more data to train on, so they need more. They're ravenous for data. And people are giving it away with their questions. And with the, are you sure about that? What about this? So, yeah, we should encourage people to do that. And we should look at how we can make sure that we are, as a country, getting the most value from that. And maybe that we see it in the people and that they are enabled by this and able to do more. I think that's probably more the way forward than the past, which has been more about trying to limit the information and saying that knowing the information when other people don't is your USP. I do think that we're getting down to more core things that are your USP than just your access to those things.
So just to help us sort of steer through that, I mean, both of you are, engaged with technology, run technology-based companies. So as you think about AI, what that means about how you go about your day-to-day, how does that shape how you think about, you organise around problem, organise your businesses, and seek to arrange things in order to meet your customers and your clients' demands? I.e., what I'm trying to get at, I think we all probably have a very 20th century sort of thing, model in our heads about what a business looks like. That there's a chief executive, and then he has or she has 4 to 6 then kind of vice presidents or whatever the latest job title is, and they will have a column, and there may be some horizontals. But that, to my mind, goes because that's throwing people at an information problem. When you think about your business, how should we be thinking about organising and organisations, and what should those principles be if AI is in the mix? I'll start with Steve.
Yeah, our organisation is quite flat, and that gives us a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages at the same time. But in the past, we did a lot of business with oil companies, and they would send us a contract that was maybe 500 pages long. And as a company at the time that was 3 people, that would have taken us quite a long time to digest, understand, and we couldn't really afford anyone that was qualified to look at it. So what did we do back in the old days? We just signed it, moved on. I think now people actually have the ability to use these things to help understand what they couldn't have before. It wouldn't have been possible. So in the startup that didn't have an in-house lawyer, now they've got something that's almost competent and able to help them. The same with accountants. But it comes down to then, so what is the company doing? Because if it's a company that has lawyers, now all the lawyers are actually doing less work, but more is getting done. It's a really interesting question. I do think it's one that we can't change. It's just going to happen. And it's about how we make sure that we steer the public through it in the most structured way possible, because it's going to change an awful lot. A lot of people say this is a bubble. In terms of the investment in AI companies, I would agree with them. When it comes to the likes of OpenAI and others, the things they're building you can download for free and you can run them. So the value isn't there. The value is somewhere else. If we know the answer to that, it'd be really good to do some investments in the stock market. But we know that it is a bubble. But that doesn't mean AI isn't massive, and it doesn't mean it's not going to change society. It really is.
And likewise, Leo, I mean, if you were to sort of explain what a 21st century company that embeds AI, what's its sort of organising principles? Because it's not about functional silos based around information, because the AI will do that for you. What do you think the organising principles are for an AI-based company is?
I think, as Steve mentioned, we're at a very early stage. The company was made on the 5th of November, almost a fortnight ago. But the ambition is to have a very flat structure, as Steve mentioned. And I think a lot of the great tech companies that we look at, software development companies, B2B SaaS companies that we're looking at, they're focused on a flat structure as well. You know, we have a VP, for example, at Apple. We're looking at the VP of the AirPods in Asia, for example. We want to employ the same sort of structure within Zinc to have different products on the market to make sure that we're solving the problems that are at hand, that we want to go ahead and solve, but making sure we have a specialist in every sector as well. So let's say, for example, the legal firms that we're looking at, the likes, of, let's just say, Dentons, I think we'll see, well, I predict anyway, that we're going to see a lot less lawyers there and a lot more in-house counsel for a lot of companies, because we want to have a specialist on board, and they can use the AI tools to be able to have their own interns, if you will, their associates. So they can use these guys to have their own legal firm within the company. And I imagine that's something that Zinc that we would do as well. We would over time have a specialist within music law and technology law, and be able to have them employ AI, be able to use AI, make sure that they understand how to use it. Because there's also a good way, like a really good way to use AI. And I spend a bit of time speaking to a lot of people my dad's age, telling them there's a good way to use AI and there's a bad way to use AI in terms of what kind of output you want and how prompting actually works. I think Steve will be able to tell you a bit more about that, but prompting is really important when you're getting a decision from the AI and how you use it. And I'm sure everybody here uses AI. It's in that structure that we want to have specialists connected to the AI within the system. So I think, yes, we will be using a lot of AI. However, we will have specialists sitting on top of those projects, on top of owning and having responsibility and accountability for the problems that they're solving and what they're saying in the meetings with us. But having that assistant, an artificial assistant more than anything else, and not actually replacing those jobs.
I'd just like to ask one final question again. So Steve, you said something quite interesting about trust, and the reason it's interesting to me in particular is that it aligned with something that I encountered recently, and it actually relates to also things that Leo was saying. So I was in Singapore and I met with Enterprise Singapore there, and it's always really interesting. I like looking at kind of different governments and their policies, their agencies, but all too often they come up with the same stuff. And sure as eggs, there was a lot of things there that you'd see, they saw them name check life sciences, you saw them name check space, they name check AI. These are all their growth sectors, and so far so good. You could replicate those anywhere else, and indeed they were slightly surprised that Scotland was focusing on those same things too. They hadn't realised it. But the one area which was interesting, they had one of their domains for growth was the trust economy. Now, and that replaced two things, both financial services, but also actually probably what we would have probably put as normal as tech. And I thought that was quite interesting, because it actually was identifying something that's more essential rather than actually kind of how you're doing things, is actually what is the underlying point. And I wonder if you could just maybe explain, because you're right, I think there are some elements there about Scotland and trust. I mean, if you were to sort of outline, what are the things that you think that maybe make Scotland a place that we can focus on trust and how we can build that? I mean, if we were to build a trust economy in Scotland, what in your mind might that look like if we were wanting to outcompete Singapore on that?
Well, first I'd say, as someone from Scotland who looks at Scottish people and is always surprised at how much of a mark we make in history for the population we've got, we should absolutely aim for having the massive impact that we can. When it comes to the trust economy, the easiest thing to look at is banking. There's a massive amount of trust of putting all of your assets and money in an institution, and you have to trust that they're not going to take it away. That's true of everything you do, though, because as soon as you exchange, as you buy something, you're trusting who you're buying from, and that is the essence of trade. So trust. I'm amazed that that Singapore had brought that up, but if you get that as a brand, and I mean a brand for the country, then you solve so many problems with trade with other countries. And you make it, if it's internal as well, if you're generating that trust internally, you have less infighting, you have much more positive economic benefit for everyone. How do we do that? I think that we do that by showing the positive benefits of generating trust, how to create trust, and really giving people stories around that with examples. I think that a brilliant thing is that the most looked at person from business in the planet has the perfect example. He was massively trusted and then did something that wasn't seen to be moral. And that trust vaporised. It vaporised completely, and everyone's mind changed. So we've got the best example to point at the moment, to say to people, if you're building a business and it's going really well, which I'm sure he thought his was, there's always a place to fall to. And if we can get that trust and keep it, then we can perhaps do a lot more than we would have otherwise.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think we have definitely run out of time, although we have certainly not run out of questions. And can I thank both our panels for validating my degree choice and given that I am a philosophy graduate. Look, with that, can I just thank you both for your time this morning? It's been extremely useful. I think we have got a lot to think about, and I am now worried about how we are going to pull this together in a single report. I think we might have to use some AI ourselves in order to do that. Thank you so much, and I'll draw the public session to a close. Thank you.